A Dance with Dragons, released on July 12, 2011, is George R. R. Martin's fifth, and for the past 14 years, most recently published book in the A Song of Ice and Fire series. And today, comrades of all genders and ages, my name is The Advocate, and we are advocates for summarizing this 1100 to 1200 page behemoth into, well, whatever length of video this winds up being. So without further ado, let's jump into the field and see what's going on. Oh, and if it wasn't already obvious before. So we're right back in Planetos with the continents of Westeros and Essos here in the foreground of this map. And a couple of you might be asking yourselves, wait a minute, Advocate, I saw your summary video for A Feast for Crows and quite a few of these characters are further along on their journeys. Why all of a sudden is Brienne of Tarth back here a little bit north of King's Landing? And that's a very good question, fellow comrade, and to answer that question, just like A Feast for Crows, yes, A Dance with Dragons does follow the events immediately after A Storm of Swords. Meaning, just as I mentioned in my A Feast for Crows summary video, the events of A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons are chronologically congruent with each other. However, unlike A Feast for Crows, where we predominantly follow the adventures of the characters in King's Landing and the southern half of Westeros, A Dance with Dragons follows the characters parallel to that in northern Westeros, including the locations here at the Wall and north of the Wall, and all of Essos. Now, truthfully, I do enjoy every single book in the A Song of Ice and Fire series. However, if I had to pick a least favorite, it definitely would be this one, A Dance with Dragons. There's quite a few chapters here in this book, which I'm going to skim through rather quickly with some of these, that I feel were not totally necessary for the overall understanding of this book and series at large, that I think George R. R. Martin could have cut out, and it would have made for a more concise and more exciting story by comparison. Instead, A Dance with Dragons, in my opinion, feels like a very long book with flashes of brilliance here and there, and for sure some fantastic and immersive stories here and there, but quite a bit of it does feel like it's bloated, like it's lagging the story, really slowing things down, and I'm just not a fan of it. But we'll take a closer look as we summarize these events here. So let's get things started by hopping straight into the prologue of A Dance with Dragons here at the location north of the Wall. Oh, and by the way, real quick, prior to the events of the prologue in A Dance with Dragons, A Feast for Crows prologue had our novice here, Pate, fight the dust. So let's remove him here from the map just for consistency and synchronizing sake. So north of the Wall, we have this character named Varamir Sixskins, who, if you don't remember, is one of the wildlings that was traveling with Jon Snow, Tormund Giantsbane, Mance Rayder, Ygritte during Jon Snow's adventures north of the Wall in a Storm of Swords. And Varamir Sixskins currently finds himself dying after being stabbed by a wildling. So, as a last-ditch resort, Varamir, who, similar to Jon Snow, has the ability to warg into other things, people, animals, just whatever he wants to warg into, tries to warg into his companion, this young wildling girl named Thistle. However, his warging attempt is unsuccessful, and Thistle runs away. So, instead, Varamir, seeing that there's no way out, just as Varamir is dying, he wargs into his wolf. Potential foreshadowing there for something that'll happen way later on in this book, but we'll get to that when we get to that. Anyway, Varamir's inside the body of his wolf, while the physical embodiment of Varamir Sixskins dies. So Varamir Wolfskins, or whatever you want to call him now, him and his wolf pack decide to travel along north of the Wall, just see what else there is, and they later discover Thistle, the girl that he was trying to warg into, has died. She's become frozen, but not only frozen, she's resurrected as a white. Oh my gosh, she is now an other. So this chapter kind of communicates to us that not only is Varamir able to warg into other animals, and thus alerting us to the fact that this is an ability that people who can warg into have potentially as they're getting close to death, but it also warns us that the others are growing. There's a lot of dead bodies up here north of the Wall that could potentially become part of this army of the others, and people in Westeros and Essos better watch out, because once they're bored and get tired of zombieing around here north of the Wall, they're going to come south of the Wall and create a whole bunch of chaos for our people down there. But anyway, A Dance with Dragons proper starts us off with our old pal Tyrion. Tyrion Lannister, who we haven't seen since the Storm of Swords, reeling from his murder of Shae and Tywin Lannister, has finally made it to Pentos. He is offloaded amongst other shipping cargo and makes it all the way to Illyrio Mopatis' manse, We haven't seen him since the Game of Thrones. So once there, we get into the head of a more villainous Tyrion this time around, a darker Tyrion, a Tyrion that's more about vengeance and more about laughing in the face of other people's misfortune. This darker Tyrion, who I find interesting, but definitely takes some getting used to on a first read through. He arrives here in Illyrio Mopatis' manse. Illyrio Mopatis just kind of grins along, and it's like, oh, welcome, welcome. I am friends with Varys, your former companion in Westeros. Varys and I are BFF chums. And Tyrion's just kind of wondering himself, like, what the heck? There's something going on here. So anyway, throughout his entire time at Illyrio Mopatis' manse, he contemplates about Tywin Lannister's last words, or some of his last words to Tyrion, when Tyrion had asked Tywin about, hey, what the heck ever happened to Tysha? Tysha being Tyrion's former girlfriend / fiance, who he was engaged to marry when he was 15, who Tyrion legitimately loved, but it turns out that Tywin didn't want this marriage to go through because I guess Tysha was too low-born or whatever. So he made up this lie that Tysha was a whore and had Jaime Lannister in on this lie in order for Tywin to justify to himself that, like, yes, no son of mine will marry a whore. So when Tywin was dying, Tyrion had asked Tywin, where is Tysha? And Tywin replied by saying, wherever whores go. So Tyrion, throughout this entire chapter, and also throughout this entire book, will consistently be saying to himself, oh, where do whores go? Wherever whores go, that is where I'm going. So all this to say, Tyrion has kind of made it his mission to try to find Tysha wherever she may be. But anyway, as he's here in Pentos, he explores around the manse. Tyrion collects these very poisonous mushrooms that he just in case he ever needs to kill someone off at a later point in time. And then over dinner, Illyrio is feasting Tyrion over this just majestic dinner table, lots of dishes, lots of food. And Tyrion is just like, why the hell are you helping me? Like, what's in this for you? Why did Varys send me to you? And so Illyrio tells Tyrion that Westeros is in need of saving. And Tyrion asks, like, well, like, why do you care that Westeros needs saving? And if you know that it needs saving, then who could save Westeros? And Illyrio replies with, a dragon with 3 heads. That's who. And boom, from that moment on, the reader is now aware that Tyrion at some point in the series is going to meet up with Daenerys, and we're going to finally have a union of Westeros and Essos. About frickin' time. But speaking of Essos, Dany, who is currently off in Meereen, having seated herself there as queen after taking Meereen over in a storm of swords, begins petitioning with a lot of just really boring political individuals whose names start with some combination of Q, X, or Z that just, oh my gosh, on a first read through, I just could not care for any of these SOC individuals. But anyway, a lot of these SOC individuals petitioned to Daenerys for her to reopen the fighting pits in order to increase revenue in Meereen. You see, Dany, once she took over Meereen, the first thing she did was she decided to just end slavery, and she believed that that was going to be the end of Meereen's slavery problems. But just like in the real life, you can't just say like, oh, this bad thing that's been happening for generations will no longer happen and everything is better and hunky-dory now. It doesn't quite work that way. But anyway, Dany refuses to reopen the fighting pits because slavery is bad. So Meereenese soldiers are being attacked by Sons of the Harpy as retribution for Dany's refusal. And so Dany is aware that the Sons of the Harpy are going against Dany's wishes, but Dany remains resilient in her desire to say no to slavery and say no to the fighting pits. And then at one point throughout this petitioning, a lowly Meereenese citizen comes up to Daenerys and he shows her these bones. And Dany sees these bones and she realizes what the heck is going on. These bones are the burnt bones of a child that was burned alive by Dany's dragons. So Daenerys, being scared and worried that this might happen to other Meereenese children, to other slave children, she goes to where her dragons are, Victarion, Rhaegal, and Drogon. Drogon manages to get away, but she's able to chain Victarion and Rhaegal in a pit underground of Meereen, and thereby, in her mind, quell whatever challenge may come from these dragons flying out and about and burning potential Meereenese citizens. But anyway, going from the A Song of Fire to the A Song of Ice, we meet up with another character who we haven't seen since the Storm of Swords. Or, I guess, if you want to be technically accurate, since that one lowly Samwell Tarly chapter in A Feast for Crows, Jon Snow, Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. Having been raised up as Lord Commander at the end of the Storm of Swords, Jon Snow is currently having very vivid wolf dreams of warging into Ghost. Jon Snow treats with Stannis Baratheon, the one true king, Stannis the Manus, I stand for Stannis. And Stannis, currently here staying at the wall during this time while he tries to kind of contemplate what happens next, tells Jon that, I, Stannis Baratheon, the one true king, the Manus, I want more lands and castles across Westeros. And Jon is like, bro, I've already given you a lot of land here at the gift along the northern part of the north, just south of the wall. What more do you want? Like, you're pretty ungrateful here. But anyway, they both grumble, and then Melisandre eventually asks to walk with Jon Snow once the meeting is finished, and she warns Jon Snow that, Jon, here in the Night's Watch, there's lots of daggers in the dark. I think you need to be careful. There's a lot of people here in the Night's Watch that want to do you harm, Jon. And Jon is like, there's nothing new. I know people in the Night's Watch are grumbling about how I'm handling things here as Lord Commander. I know they're up to no good, probably. And Melisandre just shakes her head at Jon, and she's like, you know nothing, Jon Snow. And Jon is taken aback by this, like, Melisandre just kind of runs off, just kind of probably giggling to herself. It's like, that got his attention. Anyway, further north of the wall, we run into another character who we haven't seen in a while. Bran Stark. Oh, our lowly, young, pretty unpopular amongst the fandom, Bran Stark. Bran, Jojen Reed, Mira Reed, Hodor, and Cold Hands. Cold Hands being this still alive kind of zombie who helped Samwell Tarly close to the end of A Storm of Swords, helped him fight off a couple of the others, and who is currently accompanying Bran on his way to make Bran see the three-eyed crow. They're currently wandering here throughout the haunted forest along north of the wall. And throughout their adventure, Bran begins warging into Summer, his direwolf, similar to how Jon is warging into Ghost. Bran decides to warg into Summer. It's a Stark family affair. Everybody loves just warging into their wolves, their direwolves. And at one point throughout their adventure up here north, they see Varamir's Sixskins wolf pack, Varamir, who is already a wolf, and Bran, well, Summer's wolf pack, take down Varamir's Sixskins and defeat Varamir, as Varamir just kind of runs off scared, and at some point Varamir the wolf is probably going to lose all of Varamir and just become the wolf entirely. So Bran, celebrating his victory over Varamir Wolfskins, decides to feast on the Night's Watch soldiers that the Varamir Wolfpack were feasting on, and it's heavily hinted that these soldiers were the Night's Watchmen who mutinied at Craster's Keep and killed Jeor Mormont, the previous Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, in A Storm of Swords. So yeah, Bran's summer feasts, and then Bran wakes up, and Jojen once again reminds Bran that he shouldn't rely too heavily on his wolf dreams, because one day he will lose the boy Bran and will become the wolf Summer entirely if he stays in Summer way too long. So Bran and crew continue adventuring here. All the while they kind of ask themselves, who the heck is Cold Hands? They know that Cold Hands is dead, but they're still very curious about him and are unsure of Cold Hands' loyalties. And before anyone asks, no, Cold Hands is not Benjen Stark. That was the popular theory prior to 2011 Dance of Dragons release, and George R. R. Martin has confirmed in a note to his editor that Cold Hands is indeed not Benjen Stark. But anyway, back in Essos, we rejoin an old pal in Tyrion Lannister, as Illyrio Mopatis is currently escorting Tyrion Lannister to see a father-son duo named Griffon Young Griff. Griffon Young Griff will travel with Tyrion along the river of Essos here in order to go see Dany in Volantis. And then from Volantis, they will join up with the Golden Company and then head off towards Westeros in order to take over Westeros. And throughout this entire journey, Tyrion is kind of just contemplating to himself, what the heck does Illyrio see in any of this? Is he just like, oh, you know, I only care about the well-being of Westeros, therefore I want Dany to rule Westeros because that's what's best for the people. Tyrion is suspicious. No, there's something here for Illyrio's profit that Illyrio is not communicating to Tyrion. And in addition to that, Tyrion also questions, why would the Golden Company want to help Daenerys Targaryen take over Westeros? Like, what's in it for them? The Golden Company hates Targaryens. And so Illyrio Mopatis just kind of shrugs off his concerns. It's like, well, they just want to be on the winning side for once. The Blackfire Pretenders are dead. Dany can help them get their home back. And Tyrion just continues to have his doubts. But anyway, Illyrio releases Tyrion as he meets up with a couple people named Halden Halfmaester and Raleigh Duckfield. And Tyrion, going under the guise of YOLO, decides to go with them and then finally meet up with our father-son duo of Griff and Young Griff. Tyrion immediately notes that there's something about Griff that immediately tells YOLO, or I guess he's now going by Hugor Hill, that there's something up with this Griff. He looks very familiar. So Tyrion, kind of taking a slight jab at our old Griff here, he tells him, oh yes, life is full of mad tales and winged lions. And Griff immediately catches Tyrion's drift. We as a first-time reader maybe don't, on a second-time read you kind of do, and tells Hugor Hill, guard your tongue unless you want to lose it. and off they go, sailing across this river on their way to Volantis. Back in Castle Black, oh boy, there's a lot of hopping around here between Jon, Tyrion, and Dany. You guys better get used to it, because I guess George R. R. Martin was just restraining himself so much with A Feast for Crows to hold back from Jon Snow, Daenerys Targaryen, and Tyrion Lannister's stories, to the point that he's kind of making up for it here in A Dance with Dragons by just really delving us into their worlds here in these first couple of chapters of the A Dance with Dragons book. But anyway, Jon Snow forces Gilly to swap babies with Mance Rayder's son, a kind of slight plot twist at the beginning of A Feast for Crows, but now that we know about the baby swap through the Samuel Tarly chapters in A Feast for Crows, it's kind of just an open secret here between Jon Snow and Gilly, where he forces Gilly to give up her baby in order to take Mance Rayder's son, because Jon is worried that Melisandre will want to burn Mance Rayder's baby, given that Melisandre kind of has a penchant for burning anything with any sort of royal bloodline. So Gilly, Sam, and Aemon head off towards Eastwatch, where they then head off towards Braavos. You know that story. We've done that in A Feast for Crows. After that, Jon Snow confronts Janos Slynt about potentially garrisoning one of the empty castles here along the wall. Really, there's only 3 that are currently of use, including Castle Black. Jon Snow wants to make sure that every castle is garrisoned in order to provide more protection against the threat of the others north of the wall. However, Janos Slynt decides to kind of spit in Jon Snow's face and be like, why the hell does a bastard tell me what to do? And so Jon Snow is like, you better go now, or else there will be consequences. And Janos Slynt's like, what? You're going to put me in your little ice cell? You're going to give me a little teddy bear, Jon Snow, bastard Snow? So Jon Snow being like, all right, you want to play like that? Fetch me my block. And Janos Slynt opens his eyes like, what? So a couple of the Night's Watchmen grab Janos Slynt, and they fetch Jon Snow his block, this chopping block. They push Janos Slynt's head down over the block. Janos Slynt is like, oh, like, let me go. I'll be good. And Jon Snow's like, nope, you had your chance. This is over. How dare you disobey me? Say goodbye. So in one of the book's coolest scenes, Jon Snow takes his sword and then chops Janos Slynt's head off, essentially executing him for disobeying the Lord Commander. And unbeknownst to him, he later, he looks up to see Stannis looking at him, but he didn't realize Stannis was there. Jon Snow looks at him and is like, oh, the one true king, Stannis the Manus, is looking at me. And Stannis just gives him a Manus nod like, do your duty, Jon Snow. And Jon is like, my daddy is proud. But anyway, we're not done here yet, because Mance Rayder, who has been staying here as a prisoner at Castle Black, Melisandre decides that now is a perfect time as any to burn Mance Rayder. And Mance Rayder is shocked. He's like, what are you doing, you witchy woman? And Melisandre, in some kind of funeral pyre ceremony, decides to burn Mance Rayder at the pyre. And Mance Rayder's like, no, I'm actually not the real Mance Rayder. You can't be burning me alive. I'm actually someone else. No! And so Mance Rayder burns, and Melisandre looks on, and Stannis draws the Lightbringer sword from the funeral pyre, and he shows it to all the Night's Watchmen, and he shows it to the wildling captives, and everyone oohs and ahs, except for Clytus. Clytus, a steward at Castle Black, who looks on the sword and tells Jon, it's really strange. For Stannis Baratheon, being the alleged Azor Ahai, this Lightbringer sword that he has sure seems to be lacking in producing heat here. And Jon Snow contemplates this for a quick millisecond. He's like, I don't have time to worry about this. I'm off to do my other Night's Watch duties. Off in Meereen, Unsullied are being killed in the middle of the night by Sons of the Harpy. Dany is slowly losing her grip on the city of Meereen. However, that night, an individual who we haven't seen in quite a while, Quaithe, visits Dany in the middle of the night, and she tells her, the glass candles are burning. Soon comes the Pale Mare, and after her the others, Kraken and Dark Flame, Lion and Griffon, the Sun's Son, and the Mummer's Dragon, hint, hint, wink, wink. Trust none of them. Remember the Undying. Beware the perfumed Seneschal. Implying a potential traitor in her court. Probably Reznak Moraznak. He's the only perfumed guy in her court, but what do I know? Anyway, soon afterward, Dany pisses off Shadowshoan Daxos, a merchant prince of Qarth who is currently visiting her in Meereen, one of the people that's also trying to get her to open the fighting pits. And Dany, still standing firm by her desire to not abolish slavery, tells Shadow to F off. And Qarth, consequently in that moment, decides to leave a bloody glove at Meereen's doorstep on Dany's doorstep, because Shadowshoan Daxos and Qarth have officially declared war. Off in the Dreadfort, haven't been to that place actually, I don't think we've been to that place in the entire series. Big Walder and Little Walder, remember those guys? We haven't seen them since the Clash of Kings. Enter into a cell deep beneath the cells of the Dreadfort, and they find a scrawny, emaciated prisoner who's missing fingers and toes and other parts of his male anatomy. This poor, emaciated prisoner has been flayed, as the Boltons are like to do. And this person is named Reek. Not to be confused with the Reek who got killed in a Clash of Kings, but a different Reek entirely. The boys, Little Walder and Big Walder, being pieces of garbage, decide to mock Reek before dragging him before the big supervillain of Advanced Dragons, Ramsay Bolton, who delights in taunting his broken captive in front of Arnulf Karstark and Hothor Umber, a couple of Northmen who are currently staying at the Dreadfort who own lands here in the north. And during one of these sentences, Karstark even mentions something along the lines of, "So, this is the Stark ward, eh?" Now, to many readers, I'm sure the real identity of this flayed individual is super obvious. However, on a first-time read-through, I stupidly didn't catch the identity of who this person is supposed to be. I kind of was just like, who the heck is Reek? Like, I thought Reek died. I guess there's another Reek. So for the purpose of the summary, I'm just going to play along and pretend that I don't know who this Reek really is, because the story doesn't tell you who Reek really is until further on in the story. But typically, you kind of should already have an idea by this first chapter as to the real identity of this individual. But anyway, deep in the grips of Stockholm Syndrome, Reek is very obedient and submissive and fearful of his master, Ramsay Snow / Ramsay Bolton. And Ramsay, satisfied with the control he has over his pet, his little Reek buddy, who he just loves torturing and giving noogies to, he's like, "Oh, my Reek pet, I want you to I'm going to send you on a mission." And Reek is just like, "Oh, I just want to make my master happy and proud so my master doesn't beat me. Oh, I'm Dobby through your Lucius Malfoy." And so Ramsay sends Reek off on a mission. Off north of the Wall, Bran, Jojen Reed, Mira, Hodor, and Cold Hands continue on their adventures to make it to the Three-Eyed Crow's cave. They are attacked on the way to the cave by a couple of whites. They fight them off, and then they make it inside to the cave of the Three-Eyed Crow. Bran meets the Children of the Forest, and then he meets the Three-Eyed Crow himself, the last Green Seer, who's probably just a very old blood raven. Meanwhile, off in Sisterton, haven't been there, we meet up with two characters, Salladhor Saan and Davos, the Onion Knight, Stannis' trusty Onion Knight. Salladhor Saan, being frustrated with Stannis' ability to make do on his promises and his payments, decides to head south. He's like, "Davos, I'm done with this nonsense. I'm ditching Stannis' camp." And Davos, being the loyal Onion Knight to the one true king, Stannis the Manus, says, You go ahead, Salladhor Saan. I will make sure to go to White Harbor and to all these other places and treat with these people in order to make sure that Stannis is enough men." And Salladhor's like, "You're freaking high, man. I'm done with this. Bye." So he leaves Davos alone. And so Davos, staying true to his cause, decides to talk to a couple of lords around this area, Lord Godric Borrell and his men, trying to convince them to join Stannis' cause. They're hesitant to do so, but they're like, "Sure, whatever, just don't tell anybody we were here, and don't tell anybody that we support Stannis." And then he heads off towards White Harbor to meet up with Wyman Manderly, where Davos is then arrested and held hostage. However, after being held hostage for 18 days, Davos is finally allowed to speak to Lord Wyman Manderly, the Lord of White Harbor. And in front of Wyman Manderly and a couple of Frey envoys who are currently staying with Wyman Manderly for an upcoming wedding, Davos asks Wyman Manderly, please join the cause of Stannis Baratheon, the one true Manus. However, the Freys who are in attendance in Wyman's court, they berate Davos and they lie to Wyman, telling him that like, "Oh, why would you support this guy? Robb Stark transformed into a wolf at the Red Wedding and killed your son Wendell. Why would you want to go for another false king? You should stay with King Tommen and the Freys and Boltons and all of us very good people who definitely would not do some Red Wedding shenanigans like the Starks are wont to do, and also like this Stannis Baratheon is probably want to do as well." So Wyman, having heard enough, he's like, "All right, calm down everybody, calm down Freys. Davos, I've heard your plea, but guess what, bro? I can't have this in my court. I can't be ruling Stannis Baratheon. This House Manderly is all for King Tommen. You, Davos, you are to be executed." And the Freys celebrate like, yeah. And Wyman Manderly is like, off with his head. So Wyman Manderly's men drag Davos off to a prison in order to execute him at some point later on in this book. Davos can't catch a break. Back in Castle Black, Jon is getting grumbles from the Night's Watch about how they're upset with how Jon Snow is currently running quickly through a lot of their food, given that a lot of their food is currently being given to wildling captives, the Night's Watch, and Stannis Baratheon's men. So in an effort to kind of appease the Night's Watch, and also because they do have a point they're running on food, Jon tries to convince Stannis to leave the castle by collecting men along the northern mountain towns here for Stannis Baratheon's cause, and also kind of get Stannis out of his hair. And Stannis is kind of like, oh, why would they listen to me? And Jon tells Stannis, like, bro, a lot of these people here that live in the northern mountain towns, they never see celebrities. You'll be freaking Taylor Swift. You'll be their Taylor Swift. Oh man, they'll die for your cause. And Stannis Baratheon is like, oh, you have a point, Jon Snow. Jon, Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, I, the one true King Stannis Baratheon, am grateful to you for your advice. So Stannis Baratheon, leaving Melisandre and some Kingsmen behind, decides to head off with several of his men off towards the northern mountain towns here along the north in order to collect more men for his cause, and thus leaving the Night's Watch with less mouths to feed and hopefully a more appeased Night's Watch. Off in the Royne, our new villainous darker side Tyrion is getting better acquainted with young Griff and the crew along the Shy Maid, the little boat that this entire crew is traveling through. They make it to the Royne, and Tyrion's just having a good time. He does find a little bit strange that young Griff is sure learning a lot of things that are typically reserved for noble people. He's learning about geometry and history, and Griff even tasks Tyrion with teaching young Griff about dragons and all this stuff, and Tyrion just finds it very, very suspicious. So Tyrion, wanting to get to the bottom of things, he decides to play a game of Kivas. It's essentially the Planetos' version of chess. He decides to play Kivas with Haldon Halfmaester, where the loser has to give up information to the winner. This in an effort for Tyrion to learn something about what the heck is going on with this crew. So Haldon loses, and it is implied that Haldon tells Tyrion who Griff and young Griff really are. So as Tyrion, Griff, young Griff, Septa Lemore, it's this Septa who's very attractive per Tyrion Lannister, and everyone else, Haldon Halfmaester, Duck, are making it towards the Sorrows. Tyrion reveals to Griff of what he learned from Haldon Halfmaester, and what he also pieced together based on his own observations about how strange it was that young Griff is learning all these things that, again, typically are reserved for the Westerosi nobility. Because he's found out that plot twist, the biggest plot twist of A Dance of Dragons, and probably the biggest plot twist of these most recent 2 books on the A Song of Ice and Fire series. Griff is the late Rhaegar Targaryen's best friend and former Hand of the King, Jon Connington. And young Griff, bear with me, is the still alive son of the deceased former prince, Rhaegar Targaryen. Young Griff is Aegon Targaryen VI. Wow. This opens up so much lore potential here within this series. Similar to our Fire and Blood reveal here at the end of A Feast for Crows, there's so many opportunities here for where George R. R. Martin could take this story now that we have a very much still alive Targaryen noble prince who isn't Daenerys Targaryen, and what may come from the future of this series with the revelation of this individual. It's fantastic. It opens up so many opportunities, and I'm super excited to see where we go from here. But anyway, throughout this entire, diatribe that Tyrion is going on, Tyrion also reveals himself to be a Lannister in front of Griff and young Griff, and Jon Connington's like, of course you're Tyrion Lannister. I didn't have any doubts that you weren't Tyrion. And just as Tyrion is kind of going off and mocking them about like, ha, I know you're Jon Connington and Aegon Targaryen VI, na 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 na. The Shy Maid is then attacked by Stonemen. Stonemen being these men that have been essentially consumed by grayscale, this disease that leaves you stony and gray. The disease that Shireen Baratheon, Stannis Baratheon's daughter, has. And so Tyrion gets his this torch to be like back you stonemen, back I say. And so Griff also gets his sword out and does battle with these stonemen, getting them off his boat. Tyrion tries to defend the newly revealed Aegon Targaryen as well, but as he does so, he's knocked into the water of the Royne. And Jon Connington, for some reason, I guess not wanting to allow Tyrion Lannister to die, despite the fact that Tyrion Lannister is just kind of mocking him throughout this entire adventure of the Shy Maid, Jon Connington decides to jump into the water and rescue a Tyrion Lannister who's currently drowning because one of the stonemen is dragging Tyrion Lannister down to the river floor. Jon Connington pulls him out, and he rescues Tyrion Lannister. Oh man, this is super, super exciting. Again, George R. R. Martin, when it comes to closing up plot threads, he closed up some plot threads pretty successfully in the first 3 books, but he's opened up quite a few plot threads here in these latter 2 books that I'm just super excited to see where we go from here, how he kind of hopefully trims the hedges on this garden and kind of replants them into this beautiful flower so that they can bear fruit. But from one twist to another, we now turn to the biggest twist in A Feast for Crows, that being the reveal of Lord Doran Martell's long-kept secret revealed to Arya at the end of A Feast for Crows, his son Quentyn Martell going off into Meereen to try to ask for Daenerys Targaryen's hand in marriage and therefore kickstart this Martell and Targaryen alliance that will then rule all over Westeros and thus complete Doran Martell's revenge scheme against the Lannisters for killing Oberyn Martell and more importantly, for killing his sister, Elia Martell, at Robert's Rebellion back 15 to 16 years ago. So Quentyn Martell, accompanied by Gareth Drinkwater and Archibald Ronwood, they previously had 2 other people in their crew, but they got murdered along the way, along their journey. They embark on a little bit of a fool's quest in an effort to marry Daenerys to Quentyn. They're not fully thinking this through. It's not a certainty that Daenerys will say yes to Quentyn Martell, but they're going through with this poor man's plan. So they arrive into Volantis and they join a sellsword company called the Windblown in an effort to try to make it to Meereen with this Windblown sellsword company, despite the fact that the Windblown are currently being represented by the Yunkish, Daenerys Targaryen's Meereenese enemies. Back in Westeros, Reek completes his mission of making it to Mount Caelin, and there he decides to treat with the Iron Men currently staying at Mount Caelin. The Iron Men that were there were currently left behind by Victarion Greyjoy, as Victarion Greyjoy went off to the Iron Islands in order to participate in the King's Moot that took place in A Feast for Crows. Actually, it's currently taking place in A Feast for Crows. Reek treats with these Iron Men, and the Iron Men, desperate and starving, immediately surrender to Reek after being promised food and safe passage. However, it's all a lie because Ramsay Bolton / Ramsay Snow immediately decides to kill off all the Iron Men that had surrendered Moat Caelin, and then Ramsay just kind of pets Reek on the head and be like, "Oh, good boy, good boy. You are here from this moment promoted to being my dog, Ramsay's dog." And of course, Reek is all too proud, like, "Oh, I get to be your dog. Oh, thank you, my master." And it is also at this moment that Roose Bolton, Ramsay Bolton's father and the actual ruler of the Dreadfort, arrives at Moat Caelin with a guest on his horse, a guest whom he calls Arya Stark. But Reek, having had some opportunities to actually see Arya Stark back in Winterfell, again, if it's not already obvious who Reek really is, but I, as a first-time reader, it flew over my head for some dumb reason, immediately suspects that, like, wait a minute, that's not what Arya Stark looked like, and realizes that this Arya Stark isn't really Arya Stark. Anyway, back in Essos, oh my gosh, we're just really playing ping pong here between all these characters across all these geographic distances. We get another fantastic Tyrion chapter. Oh my gosh, Tyrion's just on a roll here in this first half of Dance of Dragons. Tyrion wakes up on the Shy Maid, still recovering from his injuries after the Stoneman attack. And while playing Kivas with the newly revealed Aegon Targaryen VI, Tyrion suddenly probes him for more information. Aegon claims that Varys, the scheming person back in Westeros, swapped a young Aegon Targaryen VI when he was a baby back at Maegor's Holdfast during Robert's Rebellion with the baby from a tanner's son from Pisswater Bend. And then the imposter was the one who was killed by Gregor Clegane during Robert's Rebellion, while Aegon Targaryen VI was shipped off safely away into Essos. And Tyrion kind of puzzles out about how strange that is, about like, oh, really? You went straight across the Narrow Sea and were raised in secret under Illyrio Mopatis' protection? This seems a little strange, like consider me a skeptic. So he challenges Aegon's story with this pointed quote. "And when the Pisswater Prince was safely dead, the eunuch smuggled you across the Narrow Sea to his fat friend the cheesemonger, who hid you on a pole-boat and found an exile lord willing to call himself your father. It does make for a splendid story, and the singers will make much of your escape once you take the Iron Throne. If the Golden Company backing this alleged Aegon Targaryen VI and Jon Connington wasn't suspicious enough already as is, Tyrion's sarcasm raises even more doubts here as to young Griff's true identity. Now, we're not going to spend this video theorizing on whether or not I think young Griff is actually Aegon Targaryen VI or a Blackfyre pretender, as seems to be the mainstream theory, but if George R. R. Martin intends for Aegon Targaryen VI to actually not be Aegon Targaryen VI, but be a Blackfyre pretender, then the seeds of doubt are definitely here for this young Griff to be such a pretender. But anyway, Tyrion currently being here in a bit of a cynical and just kind of self-destructive mood as he's been throughout the first half of this book, he sees an opportunity for chaos here. He tells Aegon Targaryen Targaryen VI, that instead of going to Daenerys as a beggar boy, why not strike west towards Westeros immediately and take advantage of all the instability that is currently going on there? And Aegon, kind of eager to prove himself, takes the bait, unknowingly dooming any chance of securing Dany's dragons, as she's probably unlikely to do business with another alleged Targaryen who went into business for himself. What, you think she's going to be happy to see him just sitting on the Iron Throne, is going to just fall into Aegon Targaryen VI, allegedly, his arms and be like, oh yes, I've come to you, Aegon Targaryen VI. No, she's going to want to sit the Iron Throne on herself. So Tyrion just kind of laughs to himself, knowing that he's manipulated this boy into making a reckless decision. Oh, that villainous Dance with Dragons chaotic neutral Tyrion. But anyway, the crew arrives into Sellerys, where we then get a huge info dump on a lot of unnecessary just Volantene lore and Volantene politics information. It does kind of start feeling like bloat. I'm like, is this information really necessary, George? Tyrion manages to slip away from the crew, and he makes it inside this lowly brothel here in Sellerys. He sleeps or more appropriately, he sexually assaults a Westerosi-looking girl twice, and he then decides to just kind of sit with his shame afterward, being like, oh, well, wherever whores go, I'm supposed to be looking for Tysha. She's clearly not here. What the heck is going on? What have I become? But just as Tyrion manages to wake himself up from the stupor, who should he see as he leaves the brothel? But none other than this big, hairy man who we haven't seen since the end of A Storm of Swords, Jorah Mormont. He immediately captures Tyrion Lannister, immediately recognizing Tyrion for who he really is, and Jorah tells Tyrion, we're off to see the queen, the real queen. Meanwhile, young Griff and crew arrive at Volontheris, here more south along the Rhoyne, where they contemplate what had happened to Tyrion. Tyrion just kind of disappeared. They were never able to find him. So they set up camp here in Volontheris with the Golden Company to just kind of figure out what comes next. Connington, at this point, feels a certain kinship with the Golden Company, and then we get a little bit of a backstory about Jon Connington through this Jon Connington POV, and as he kind of relays his story of how he got exiled from Westeros and then created this fabricated story about how he allegedly drunk himself to death with the Golden Company, but in reality, he was very much still alive and just kind of hiding out here in Essos in an effort to shield young Griff, who he believes to be Aegon Targaryen VI, from any Westerosi eyes. So it's an interesting chapter. We learn more about the Golden Company's ties to House Blackfyre and the history that goes back so many hundreds of years with that, including Aegon Targaryen IV's bastard-born children and how that kind of created a whole ruckus all over Westeros. But anyway, they contemplate as to what to do next. They're like, should we go to Westeros? Should we go to Essos where Dany is? Dany's still in Meereen. What the heck is going on? But Aegon VI, young Griff, currently emboldened by Tyrion's intentionally reckless advice, pushes the Golden Company to abandon waiting for Daenerys and instead tells them, hey guys, what are we doing here? Let's strike while the iron is hot. Let's make our way west towards Westeros. Our place is there. That's our home. Let's take Westeros for ourselves. So the alleged Boy King tells them all this, believing that he will impress Daenerys Targaryen with his boldness, declaring something like, when Dany hears word of all the good I'm doing in Westeros, she'll totally cross the narrow sea and totally will marry me. We're Targaryens after all. She'll be so proud of me. Swayed by Aegon's confidence, Jon Connington and the Golden Company agree to ship off towards Westeros. But not before Jon Connington removes his glove at the end of the chapter, unveiling his hand and something curious on his fingers. He reveals to the reader a little bit of gray on his finger. Uh-oh, my man has got grayscale. Jon Connington got a little bit of grayscale on him when he rescued Tyrion Lannister from drowning at the Royne, and because of that, one of the Stonemen accidentally touched his hand, and thus Jon Connington has a ticking time bomb on his hands. His days are numbered. Anyway, off in Meereen, Hizdahr Zolorak, a Giscari noble from Meereen, proposes marriage to Daenerys. Dany agrees, but only on the condition that Hizdahr put an end to the deadly attacks from the Sons of the Harpy. Elsewhere in Essos, Quentyn Martell, alongside Archibald Yarnwood and Garrus Drinkwater, have arrived into Slaver's Bay. They are currently still working under the company of the Windblown, and in order to hide his identity, Quentyn is going by the nickname Frog. Anyway, after a lot of boring passages dedicated to the history of other sellsword companies, the Tattered Prince, the commander of the Windblown, selects Westerosi-looking people, i.e. Quentyn and crew, to infiltrate either the Second Sons or the Stormcrows, sellsword companies that are loyal to Daenerys, and the Tattered Prince asks Quentyn and crew to pose as if they're defecting to Daenerys' side. Oh, schemes on top of schemes. How fortuitous for Quentyn and co. Off in Deepwood Motte, we have the return of our first A Feast for Crows character, Asha Greyjoy. Asha Greyjoy receives a letter from Ramsay Bolton telling her that Moat Cailin, the place that Victarion Greyjoy was currently occupying, has fallen. And to really drive the point home, the letter also contains a piece of Theon Greyjoy's flayed skin. However, Asha kind of remains undeterred and decides to stay at Deepwood Motte, unwilling to return to the Iron Islands, because if she does so, she would be forced to submit to her new husband, Eric Anvilbreaker. She never personally got married, but the idea of a marriage was forced upon her by mega supervillain final boss magical Euron Crowseye Greyjoy. This in an effort for Euron to control Asha. So, while Asha decides to stay at Deepwood Motte, she decides to have sex with Galbart Glover and potentially get pregnant if a lot of theories are to be believed. And then at some point, they get ambushed by a bunch of Northmen in camouflage and disguise. The attack is swift, and despite Asha fleeing, her forces are captured by none other than Stannis Baratheon, Stannis the Manus, the one true king, and his clan of northern mountain men who he collected along the way from these northern mountain towns. Back in Essos, Tyrion and his captor Jorah Mormont make it to Volantis, and then we get this super long chapter with a lot of just, I guess, detail describing what Volantis looks like, but there's a lot of other just information here that just feels, again, like bloat. I don't think was completely necessary, but anyway, we got the super long chapter. Jorah and Tyrion, who's in chains under Jorah Mormont's watch, explore Volantis. While there, they hear news about the Golden Company having set sail for Westeros without dragons, prompting Tyrion to internally mock young Griff for his reckless decision, being like, haha, I sure fooled those two. Eventually, Tyrion and Jorah make it to the Widow of the Waterfront, this influential person who used to be a slave but has since come into money, and she holds considerable power and is their key to securing passage on a fast ship to meet Daenerys. While talking to the widow, Tyrion is attacked by a young dwarf girl named Penny. Oh boy, one of my favorite characters. She was one of the jousting dwarfs during Joffrey's wedding, and Penny blames Tyrion for her brother's death as sailors mistook Penny's brother for Tyrion and had him killed. Tyrion is like, why the heck is this my fault? But anyway, after exchanging a few words, Penny ultimately decides to join up with Tyrion and Jorah Mormont, and the widow ultimately grants Tyrion, Jorah, and Penny passage on the Selesori Koran, aka the Stinky Steward, aka the Perfumed Senescal, a cog that is bound for Karth. However, Banero, a high priest of the Lord of Light who is currently preaching here in Volantis, tells them that the Selesori Koran has been foretold to never reach its destination. Ooh. Back in Westeros, Davos Seaworth, who is currently on death row, has been summoned by Wyman Manderly to his court. And Wyman Manderly has a surprising apology that he wants to share with Davos Seaworth. His harsh treatment of Davos earlier was all an act to convince the Freys that Wyman was still loyal to Tommen Baratheon's cause. But in truth, Wyman Manderly despises the Freys and the Boltons for the murder of his son, Wendell, at the Red Wedding. He is very well aware that the poppycock that they've concocted about Robb Stark transforming into a direwolf and killing everybody there at the wedding was all a story that they told in order to besmirch Robb Stark's name. But Wyman Manderly knows that this is all a lie, and he delivers to Davos one of the coolest monologues in the entire book. The speech that Wyman Manderly delivers here is some of the best writing I've heard from a character. Oh my gosh, I get goosebumps even just thinking about it. Wyman Manderly ultimately tells Davos that he is willing to support Stannis, but only on the condition that Davos be able to successfully retrieve Rickon Stark, the last known trueborn son of Ned Stark, along with his direwolf Shaggy Dog from parts unknown. With Rickon, Manderly believes that he will be able to rally the North against the Boltons and Freys and reclaim Winterfell from Roose Bolton. However, Davos is kind of curious, like, how do you know Rickon is still alive? And what do you mean by parts unknown? So Wyman Manderly brings in this young mute observer, this mute boy named Wex Pike. He is someone who actually observed Bran and Rickon part ways when Rickon traveled with Osha and Bran traveling with Jojen, Mira, Hodor, and that entire crew off in a different direction. Wex was there observing up in a tree, and he witnessed Rickon and Osha escaping off to a remote island infamous for cannibals called Skagos, which is where Rickon currently is. Are the rumors true? Are there cannibals in Skagos? Will Davos wind up successfully retrieving the still alive Rickon Stark and bringing him back to Wyman Manderly so they can retake the North in commemoration for the Starks, the once beloved Starks, and spit in the face of the Freys and Boltons? I don't know. We're all still waiting on follow-up for that in the Winds of Winter. But man, I'm excited to find out. Off in Meereen, Dany receives dire news that Astapor, one of the cities that she came across during her travels in a storm of swords, has fallen, and its survivors are ravaged by the bloody flux, aka dysentery. With Meereen teetering on the brink, what with the Sons of the Harpy striking from the shadows and war with Astapor brewing, Dany makes the pivotal decision here that in order to stop more bloodshed, she must marry Hizdahr Solorak. So she proposes marriage to Hizdahr and confirms matrimony in an effort to secure peace. Off in Castle Black, tensions rise here as many of the brothers within the Night's Watch remain uneasy about the presence of the free folk still here. To ease the situation, Jon Snow decides to put the Wildlings to work, ensuring that they contribute and earn their place and their food here amongst the Night's Watch. So at one point, Jon duels with one of the Wildlings called Rattleshirt, and Jon kind of tells himself like, wow, this Rattleshirt is really, really good at swordplay. What the heck is going on here? So while that is going on, the duel finishes. Jon kind of comes on the losing of this duel, and then he receives a letter bearing some not nice news, because apparently an Arya Stark of some kind is set to marry Ramsay Bolton, and Jon is concerned for his sister, but Melisandre reassures him that, oh, not to worry, Jon. This Arya Stark will flee her marriage and make her way to the wall on a dying horse. Everything will be okay. She'll be fine. She'll be fine. And then Melisandre also tells Jon that she continues to have chilling visions of his death with daggers in the dark as enemies close in around Jon. She also confirms that much of her magic that a lot of people kind of are wary of Melisandre about is essentially just a bunch of smoke and mirrors. And one such act of smoke and mirrors is the bone necklace around Rattleshirt's neck. Because this necklace is an illusion to hide the very real identity of a still alive Mance Rayder. Holy smokes, what is going on? The Mance Rayder who was burned earlier on in the book was actually Rattleshirt in disguise, and Mance Rayder was then at that point disguised as Rattleshirt because Melisandre and Stannis saw potential purpose for using Mance Rayder on in the future. So Melisandre tasks Mance Rayder with going off towards Winterfell in order to rescue Arya, despite the fact that Jon doesn't trust Mance, and Mance is like, I'm not doing this for you. I'm just doing this because I want what's best for the North. So he heads off towards Winterfell. Jon is skeptical. Melisandre reassures him, and off we go here in the situation here at Castle Black. Off in Barrowtown, Roose Bolton, Ramsay Bolton, and Ramsay's pet, Reek, arrive here as Ramsay Bolton intends to hold a feast, with Reek, of course, being chained to a wall. Roose is not a fan of Ramsay's brutality and chides him so for mistreating Reek and also for just being an absolute nuisance to House Bolton. Their conversation eventually turns to the political situation in Westeros, including information about Stannis having left the Wall and amassing massive amounts of Northern Mountain men, and how Stannis will eventually come towards them, so they better prepare and be quick about it. But the Boltons have a secret scheme up their sleeve, because the Karstarks, who are currently traveling with Stannis as well, are planning to double-cross Stannis when the time is right. And that time is just outside of Winterfell, the location where Ramsay is to marry Arya Stark of Winterfell. Roost then takes Reek aside as he has him travel on horse to meet Roost's friend, Lady Barbrey Dustin. And as Roose and Reek are traveling by horseback, Roose essentially relays a bunch of information about Ramsay's lore and his upbringing. Essentially, Ramsay is a byproduct of sexual assault. Several years ago, there were two people within the Dreadfort, within the town of Dreadfort, who wanted to marry. However, they wanted to marry in secret. And Roose Bolton was pretty pissed off that they did not inform the Lord of the Dreadfort about such a marital occasion. So Roose Bolton, being the quality man that he is, he decided to invoke a tradition that has not been invoked in quite a while, and a very old tradition where the Lord of that town has the first right at the woman that is being married. So, suffice to say, Roose Bolton has the right to sleep with the wife of whoever that person is getting married to. But Roose wanting to sleep with this person isn't just enough for him, no. He's pissed off that these two people wanted to marry behind his back. So he hangs this individual, this miller, who was to marry this beautiful young maiden. He hangs this person, and then beneath the hanging noose, Roose Bolton sexually assaults and takes the woman. It's pretty disgusting. It's gross, and it tells you all you need to know about the Boltons. So because of that, Ramsay was eventually born. The miller's wife, a year later, came to the Dreadfort, where Roose was staying, telling him that this is your son. And ordinarily, Roose would hang such a person for saying such things, but Roose was taken aback by the eyes of the baby. It endeared himself onto Roose. So Roose decided to keep the baby for himself, this bastard-born son, and decided to give this woman lands for her trouble. It just kind of goes to show how Ramsay was born out of a hatred vengefulness more so than out of love. But anyway, Roose takes in Ramsay Bolton. Roose suspects that Ramsay may have killed Roose's true-born heir and true-born son when they were children, Domeric Bolton. And it's just a lot of interesting information about how Roose and Ramsay Bolton are not very nice people. But anyway, Reek and Roose eventually arrive to Barrow Hall, where they meet Lady Barbrey Dustin, and it is here, within this passage, where Roose Bolton officially, and to my shock as a first-time reader, declares Reek as Theon Greyjoy. Boom. I mean, if it wasn't already obvious before, but for me as a first-time reader it was. I was pretty gobsmacked. I was like, what the heck? Reek is Theon Greyjoy? What? But yes, the clues are very much there. Reek is a emaciated, flayed shell of his former self, Theon Greyjoy. Anyway, off in the summer sea, aboard the Celisori Coran, the perfumed Seneschal cog, Penny, Tyrion, and Jorah Mormont are making their way towards Meereen, and then a red priest there, also who is traveling with them on the Celisori Coran, Mokorro, introduces himself to Tyrion. He is a red priest from Volantis, and he is also on board the ship because he wants to help Daenerys guide her towards the Lord of Light. But anyway, throughout this passage, Tyrion also kind of slowly begins to peel off the layers of this self-destructive villain that he was kind of turning into, this bitter individual, and he kind of begins softening thanks to the Penny plot device, who, again, she's a character that I'm not too big of a fan of, not because I dislike the character completely, but she just has a certain innocence that I find incredibly annoying, especially because we as the reader, 5 books into the series, are already aware that Planetos is not a nice place to live in, but Penny is still under the belief that maybe there's some niceness here, and she kind of is horrified by all the horrors of Planetos when by this point in the series, the reader has kind of already been desensitized to all these things. Off in the cave of the Three-Eyed Crow, the mysterious Three-Eyed Crow reveals himself to be a very old Brynden Rivers, aka Bloodraven, as we discussed earlier. A Targaryen bastard who has a pretty cool moment in a certain Dunk and Egg novella, and also the former commander of the Night's Watch. Anyway, there, the Three-Eyed Crow wants to train Bran's green sing abilities, and in order to fully awaken his green sing abilities, Bloodraven feeds Bran some Weirwood paste. This kind of gelatinous, blood-looking paste that some fans have theorized to be a murdered, mushed-up Jojen reed. So they kind of spoon-feed it to Bran. He eats it, goes to sleep, and it appears that the ritual works because it seems to unlock Bran's abilities to see across time. Bran's visions through the Weirwood network allow him to witness moments from the history of Winterfell through the Weirwood tree at Winterfell. The visions kind of go backwards in time, and these visions consist of various individuals, some which we as a reader recognize, and some which readers have hypothesized as to who they could be. These include a young Ned Stark praying to the Weirwood tree that a baby Robb Stark and Jon Snow will grow up as true brothers and that Catelyn will find it in her heart to forgive Ned. A brash Arya-like Lyanna Stark defeating her younger brother Benjen in a sword duel. A pregnant woman, possibly Arya Flint, pleading with the old gods for a son to avenge her. Dunk the Lunk, aka Sir Duncan the Tall, kissing a slender brown-haired girl, possibly a very young and hot old Nan. A man breaking 3 branches off the Weirwood to shape them into arrows, potentially Brandon Snow as he wants to get rid of a dragon. A bunch of visions of the various old Stark kings, and then the last vision that appears to Bran is a chilling vision of someone's throat being slit, perhaps an original sin of sorts, as this could potentially be the King in the North executing the Night's King. Anyway, it's a whole lot of fun to reread, and I definitely recommend people to reread this passage to kind of guess as to who these various characters are. And after that moment, that's the last we see of Bran in this book. So I guess we'll have to find out what other further training adventures go on with Bran here in the Three-Eyed Crow in the Winds of Winter, and also if Jojen Reed did in fact actually get mushed up and fed to Bran as Weirwood paste. Further south in Castle Black, Jon Snow begins dispersing a bunch of wildlings across the various castles and holdfasts here along the wall. He also receives a letter from Stannis letting Jon know that he has declared victory over Deepwood Motte, has captured Asha Greyjoy, and thanks Jon for the steady growth of his army, much thanks to Jon's advice. So Stannis also reveals here that he has learned that Arya Stark intends to marry Ramsay Snow within Winterfell, and Stannis will do his best to go to Winterfell, rescue Arya, and return to the Wall with Arya in tow. So after this, Jon sends Val off on a mission towards the Haunted Forest in order to retrieve Tormund Giantsbane in an effort to get Tormund and his thousands of wildlings to come to the Wall and treat with Jon. Jon again intends to fortify the forces here along the Wall because he seems to be the only person here in the Night's Watch that is very wary of the threat of the others. And obviously when Jon goes ahead and tells his men about this, they're not very happy. He also tells his Night's Watchmen that there's a lot of wildlings here off in a town north of the walls called Hardhome, where a lot of wildlings are trying to seek refuge here from the threat of the others. The others are growing in numbers, and a lot of wildlings are making their way here towards Hardhome. Jon Snow wants to bring those wildlings from there to Castle Black, and again, this is just really making Jon public enemy number 1. It's like, oh, how dare you bring those wildlings over to our castles, Jon? Meanwhile, further south at Winterfell, Roose Bolton, Ramsay Bolton, and Reek, along with Lady Barbrey Dustin, arrive at Winterfell in preparation for the upcoming wedding between Ramsay Bolton and Jeyne. Poole, who is currently posing as Arya Stark, is desperately pleading with Theon, Reek, to rescue her. She's always found Theon Greyjoy rather comely, and she really wants him to help her escape this marriage that she's being forced into. However, Theon, utterly broken and kind of still clinging to this Reek persona, tells Jeyne Poole to only think of herself as Arya and do whatever it takes to please Ramsay. She's distraught, but with no other option and being forced against her will, she goes along with the marriage, and Ramsay officially weds Jeyne Poole / Arya in a rather cold and joyless ceremony. However, a fair few performers arrive at this Winterfell wedding ceremony, such as this man named Abel, who I feel pretty stupid. Man, there's so many things that I'm not catching on a first read through that I did not know was Mance Rayder. And the 6 female performers that are standing alongside him are his spearwives. But nonetheless, Abel and his 6 female companions just perform for the entertainment and joy of the wedding guests here at Winterfell. While all this is going on, another guest who has showed up for the wedding Wyman Manderley, who, as we've learned from the earlier Davos chapter, is not a fan of these Freys and Boltons, is feasting on some very delicious pies. Is that a Frey eyeball in there? Oh, how did that get in there? Anyway, as all this is going on, a shattered and dejected Reek wanders into the God's Wood, and drowning in despair and self-loathing, convinced that he is nothing more than Ramsay's pet Reek, he kneels before the God's Wood in search of answers. And as he does, what should he hear but someone calling his name? His real name, Theon. And Reek, or Theon in this case, kind of is taken aback and he can't believe it. He's like, what the heck is this? The voice sounded a lot like Bran too. So it's here that kind of a tiny ember of his old self kind of begins stirring up within his heart. But before he has any time to question it, Ramsay summons Reek to his quarters, and as Reek does, he notices that Jeyne, Poole, is trembling in the corner, and Reek is like, what the heck is going on? So Ramsay's like, Reek, my fellow pet Reek, this wife of mine, doesn't want to do me the pleasure of doing pleasure on me, so I need you to help her make her pleasure me. And Reek is like, well, if you want me to do what I think you want me to do, I'm physically incapable of doing that. I'm a eunuch. You took care of that, if you remember correctly. And Ramsay's like, yes, I remember that. But, well, if you can't use your male member, why not use your tongue? So, depressed and broken, he does Ramsay's bidding, and he performs on Jeyne's female anatomy in order to, quote-unquote, prepare her for Ramsay, as Ramsay just laughs and laughs and laughs. Meanwhile, further south in Westeros, we return to a couple of other people who we haven't seen since A Feast for Crows. That's right, we return to the Martell family here, as we get into Arya Hota's perspective here, and listen in on the going-ons of Doran Martell's private meeting here with his family. Fellow Kingsguard member Balon Swan has arrived into Sunspear, bearing the deceased Gregor Clegane's skull as a token of justice between the Lannisters and the Martells, and as he does, a grand Dornish feast is held in honor of Balon Swan's arrival. However, Arianne Martell, Doran Martell's eldest child and daughter, and the Sandsakes are all very skeptical of this skull and of it actually belonging to Gregor Clegane, so they have a private meeting in Doran Martell's Solar where they discuss plans for what they want to do next. Doran reveals that he instructed Myrcella to tell Balon Swan that it was Darkstar who attacked her, which is true, and they are also wanting Myrcella to tell Balon Swan that it was Darkstar who killed the Kingsguard that was protecting Myrcella in A Feast for Crows, that being Eris Oakheart, which is false. Doran also discloses that he has learned that the Dornish caravan that is set to escort Myrcella, himself, and his youngest son, Trystane Martell, back to King's Landing is set to be ambushed by outlaws. The plan, which was orchestrated by Cersei Lannister, oh, that crazy kooky Cersei Lannister, involves Trystane being killed, with the blame being pinned on Tyrion for this attack, as the outlaws will chant, half man, during the attack. However, Doran Martell has a counterplan to Cersei's initial plan by ordering Nymeria Sand and Tyene Sand to accompany Myrcella instead of Trystane and himself, the intention being to infiltrate King's Landing and also ingratiate themselves with the High Septon for potential political leverage, and also to stop whatever sellswords that Cersei has ordered to attack the Dornish caravan and not kill Trystane. Man, say what you will about George R.R. Martin's gardening, but I sure am a sucker for these Dornish schemes of Doran Martell. Meanwhile, back in Winterfell, a brutal snowstorm engulfs the castle as Jeyne Poole remains chained and naked to Ramsay Bolton's bed. She's crying, she's depressed, she's sad, and Theon just thinks to himself that there's nothing he can do about it. As this is going on in the common room, Lady Barbrey Dustin approaches Reek and asks him to escort her to the Crypts of Winterfell because she wants to see something. And in the Crypts, Lady Barbrey Dustin, in a very interesting passage, one of the most interesting passages from this A Dance with Dragons book that I didn't think I needed until I actually read it, Lady Barbrey Dustin kind of unveils a little bit of her past and kind of shares her history with regards to the Starks. She asks Theon if Theon ever wanted to be a Stark, and Reek kind of admits that, yeah, I've always wanted to be a Stark, but I knew that was never possible. And so Barbrey Dustin then retorts with like, yes, I too have always wanted to be a Stark. And here she reveals to Reek that she was once betrothed to Brandon Stark, Ned Stark's older brother and heir to Winterfell. However, Rickard Stark, Ned Stark's dad, arranged Brandon's marriage to Catelyn Tully instead of Barbrey Dustin in order to strengthen ties between Winterfell and Riverrun. Barbrey was then instead set to marry Eddard Stark as kind of like a, well, you can't get your plan A, but here's a plan B. Why not Eddard Stark? However, after Brandon and Rickard were executed by the Mad King during his reign, Eddard instead married Catelyn in Brandon's place, therefore leaving Barbrey Dustin to having to marry someone who isn't a Stark. So she ultimately married this gentleman named Lord William Dustin of Barrowtown, and off they went in a happy marriage. Until Lord William died in the Tower of Joy during Ned Stark's siege of that tower during Robert's Rebellion, which Barbrey resents Ned Stark for, not only because it caused the death of her husband, but also because Ned Stark made every effort to transport his deceased sister, Lyanna Stark, from the Tower of Joy back to Winterfell. All the while, he just did a quick burial of William Dustin in Dorne and left him there. So Lady Barbrey Dustin, she now promises that should she ever retrieve Ned Stark's bones, she will have her dogs feed on his bones. And Theon Greyjoy / Reek is kind of like taken aback by all this. First of all, that she's even disclosing all this information to him, and secondly, that she would want to do so much harm to whatever's left of Ned Stark these days. But anyway, they spend the rest of their time in the crypts. Theon notices that there's a sword missing from one of the statues, a sword that was taken by Bran Stark when he went north of the wall, and they leave the crypts. But not before Barbrey Dustin warns Theon to not repeat anything she just said to the Boltons. And Theon Greyjoy obliges. Man, what a crazy chapter. Again, Barbrey Dustin is one of those characters who I didn't think I needed to know more of until this book. I really want to learn more about her, and I hope we do get to in the Winds of Winter. Meanwhile, Stannis Baratheon and his army are marching east towards Winterfell, and as they're doing so, the snowstorm that is currently engulfing most of Winterfell has also engulfed most of their army. So Stannis Baratheon and his army are currently stranded here at a lowly crofters village that's about 3 days' march from Winterfell. Asha Greyjoy, who is currently a prisoner of Stannis Baratheon, is being imprisoned within this cage, and Stannis Baratheon means to potentially use her for a sacrifice at some point in the future. Supplies are running low, the army is beginning to starve, and harsh conditions are beginning to take a toll on the morale of Stannis' men. Elsewhere in Planetos, Tyrion Lannister, Jorah Mormont, Mokorro, Penny, and the citizens and denizens that are currently embarking on the Selesori Koran are making their way towards Meereen. However, at some point, the Selesori Koran, I guess they weren't looking on weather underground, they get caught here in the middle of a Category 5 Valyrian hurricane, and it's all sorts of havoc and nonsense. And so at one point, Mokorro gets thrown overboard, and the mast of the Selesori Koran breaks off, leaving these three and most of the people on board stranded in the middle of the ocean. That is until a ship arrives from the north, and Tyrion at first rethinks that they've been saved, only for Jorah to point out that, no, my friend, that's not a ship that's coming to save us. That's a slaver ship. And Tyrion thinks to himself, oh crap. Back in Meereen, Dany sees that thousands of Astapori refugees camped outside her city are ravaged by the bloody flux, so she orders several of her Meereenese men to cleanse and clean these Astapori refugees. Dany is a kind woman. She doesn't want anyone to be unhealthy. And she also knows that the disease could spread to her people in Meereen if they're not taken care of. So as she also prepares for her upcoming nuptials to Hizdahr Zalorak, Daario Naharis returns to Meereen. Oh boy, Daario is the perfect simp here. And much to Dany's delight, she's like, oh, I'm so belated to see you. However, Daario's not just here to rekindle an old flame with Dany, but he's also here to inform her that Brown Ben Plum and the Second Sons have officially defected to Yunkai, meaning Brown Ben Plum has betrayed Daenerys. Overcome with frustration and desire, she decides to sleep with Daario despite Brown Ben Plum's betrayal. As this is going on, Yunkish forces camp outside of Meereen's walls and build siege towers in order to hurl rocks at Meereen, and Daario, kind of a little bit of a change of subject, introduces Dany to 3 Dornishmen who have just recently defected from the other side, that being Quentyn Martell, Garrus Drinkwater, and Archibald Ronwood. They then reveal their real identities to Dany as envoys of Doran Martell, and Quentyn Martell thinking that there's no better time to propose his proposal to Dany than before Dany's actual marriage to his Lorak, decides to propose to Dany. And Dany just kind of laughs it off, and she's like, okay, well, do you have ships for me? Do you have money? Do you have gold? Do you have men? And Quentyn just looks at her like, And Dany's like, yep, that's right. It's what I thought. And as she's also saying this, she's thinking back on Quaith's cryptic warning about potentially there being a sun's son, and the sun being the Dornish flag, and the son of that son being Quentyn Martell. Dany puts two and two together and realizes that it was referring to Quentyn Martell. So again, she politely declines Quentyn's offer. Daenerys marries Hizdahr Lorak, and Quentyn, Archibald Weirwood, and Garrus Drinkwater are left in the dust. Meanwhile, back at Castle Black, Jon Snow is currently teaching the common tongue to a friendly giant called One, a friendly wildling giant, is interrupted when suddenly Queen Selyse, Shireen, Patchface, Axel Florent, and Tycho Nestrosis, a important individual from the Iron Bank of Braavos, arrive at Castle Black. And Tycho delivers a crucial message to Jon Snow, that being that the Iron Throne has stopped repaying its debts to the Iron Bank of Braavos, a foolish move given the bank's notorious reputation for toppling rulers who fail to pay their debts, and seeing an opportunity, the Iron Bank is willing to back Stannis in this war if he appears to be more capable of repaying the Iron Bank. Anyway, Jon decides to take this opportunity to haggle with Tycho and secure a loan for 3 ships in order to allow him to execute his plan of sending these 3 ships from Eastwatch up to Hardhome and rescuing all the wildlings that are currently stuck there from this potential oncoming invasion of the others. Tycho begrudgingly agrees and gives Jon these ships. The next day, a mysterious girl arrives riding furiously to Castle Black riding a dying horse, just as Melisandre foresaw in her flames. However, this individual is not Arya Stark, but rather someone else, Alice Karstark, who is currently fleeing from her father Arnulf Karstark and his friend Cregan Karstark, as Alice Karstark reveals that despite the Karstarks having publicly declared for Stannis, the Karstarks are currently secretly in league with Roose Bolton. So, desperate, Alice pleads with Jon to protect her from her treacherous family, and Jon takes her in whilst writing a letter to Stannis informing him of these would-be traitors. And ladies and gentlemen, it is here where we enter into uncharted territory with the Dance of Dragons, because from this point forward, we have officially surpassed the events of A Feast for Crows. Holy smokes, what goes on from here on out is unwritten, because this is new stuff. So we return to one such A Feast for Crows character POV, that being Arya Stark, who is currently still here in Braavos training at the House of Black and White. And she, like her bastard brother Jon Snow and her other brother Bran Stark, is having visions of herself warging into Nymeria, her direwolf who she released at the beginning of the Game of Thrones. And she continues to experience life through her direwolf's eyes. But when she wakes, she realizes that she is still blind, as she was blinded at the end of A Feast for Crows after having killed Daeron, this Night's Watch defector, despite the fact that she's not supposed to be killing people indiscriminately, as that goes against the teachings of the House of Black and White. So as punishment, she was made blind. So as she walks blind throughout the House of Black and White in this chapter of The Dance of Dragons, she is consistently, repeatedly being attacked by an acolyte, which forces her to rely on her other senses and defend herself. She decides to warg into a cat and makes a very crucial discovery. The acolyte, who is consistently attacking her, is actually the kindly man, the man who kind of manages things in the House of Black and White. She confronts the man, revealing that she knows it's him who's been attacking her, although she keeps her warging into a cat in order to find this out a secret, of course. But impressed by her growth and cunning, the kindly man restores Arya's sight and gives her her first mission. Arya finally officially partaking in the shenanigans of the House of Black and White, she goes down into a deep underground cellar of this house, where the kindly man shows her just all these rows of faces. These faces of people who have decided to end their lives here at the House of Black and White because they thought life was too much. And one such face is the face of a young, horribly disfigured girl, whose face Arya is going to wear in order to help disguise herself to kill a target. The target of which being an old man who sells insurance to ship captains and merchants, but doesn't pay out claims. Anyway, Arya slips a poisoned coin into one of the old man's client's pockets, so when it comes time for the old man to perform his insurance scam, he takes the coin from this client, bites into it, and the poison within the coin immediately goes into his bloodstream and lets his heart give out. So the old man dies, Arya's successful, and the kindly man, satisfied with Arya's successful mission, promotes her to acolyte and gives her a fancy new black and white robe. She is also given this new face to wear to participate in her next mission, and then she is also instructed to see this man named Isabaro, who is to train Arya underneath him as an apprentice. So, what does this all mean? What does Arya's first apprenticeship have in store for her? Well, we'll just have to find out in the Winds of Winter. We then return to another A Feast for Crows exclusive character, that being Jaime Lannister, who is currently having a successful run of things here in the Riverlands, you know, lifting sieges, having character development, all that good stuff. He has just lifted a Bracken siege of Raventree Hall, the ancestral seat of House Blackwood, and makes his way towards Pennytree, that town from the United of the Seven Kingdoms where Arlen Pennytree is from. We get some nice lore about Pennytree town, including, you know, a few hints here and there about the Duncan Egg novellas. However, suddenly out of nowhere, who should show up back into the story but none other than another A Feast for Crows exclusive character who doesn't actually get a POV within this A Dance with Dragons book, Brienne of Tarth, who runs towards Jaime Lannister, pleading with him to come with them, because the story she tells Jaime is that the Hound, Sandor Clegane, has Sansa Stark in his grasp, and he's going to kill her unless Jaime Lannister comes with Brienne into the Riverlands alone. So Jaime, kind of foolishly, kind of stupidly, is like, oh wow, yes, I will go there all by myself with absolutely no backup, and stupidly runs with Brienne of Tarth. And the implication is that they're returning to this place here, where Lady Stoneheart is currently there with Lem Lemoncloak and that whole Brotherhood Without Banners crew, as Lady Stoneheart commanded Brienne of Tarth to bring Jaime back to her for who knows what purpose, a trial by combat, some kind of other messed up trial. It's another one of those things where we, again, have to wait until the Winds of Winter. Oh, George, you sly little fox. Meanwhile, off in Winterfell, Roose Bolton's hosts remain trapped within the walls of Winterfell, as again that snowstorm is not letting up whatsoever. And as that's going on, mysterious murders begin to plague the castle. A bunch of people are starting to randomly die. No one knows what's going on. Tensions are flaring, and it's all sorts of chaos here. Roose summons Theon Greyjoy to his quarters, and he asks Theon Greyjoy what the heck he's been doing. He's been spotted just at all these locations where the murders have been taking place, and Theon Greyjoy kind of shows Roose his broken fingers and his broken toes, and Roose is like, yeah, you're kind of in emaciated shape, and you're just a physical mess. There's no way you could have done this. But I'm watching you, Theon. So, left adrift, Theon again wanders back to the Godswood that he's kind of made a little bit of his second home here in Winterfell. And as he does, he's once again drowning in depression and hopelessness, and he keeps hearing Bran's voice calling his name every time he sits by the Weirwood tree. And he's like, oh, what the heck is going on? Like, even the Weirwood looks like Bran. Like, I am so confused. However, before Theon can process all this, Abel's female companions, aka Mance Rayder's spearwives, approach him and tell Theon that they must come with him to see Abel. So Theon then goes to see Abel, who tells him that they are going to bust out of here with Jeyne Poole. And Theon is like, that's absolutely poppycock. That's crazy. Like, there's no way we can do that. It's a suicide mission. And Abel says, oh, you'll do it, or otherwise I'll kill you right here. And Theon's like, go ahead. I have nothing to live for. It's like, well, yeah, you do. Go ahead and just do this thing, Theon. So Theon begrudgingly just kind of goes along with Abel's spearwives as they go into Ramsay Bolton's quarters and break out Jeyne Poole. But before their plan can fully unfold, chaos erupts in the Great Hall as Little Walder has been found murdered. Big Walder immediately blames Manderley's men, despite the fact that many fans have theorized that it was Big Walder who killed Little Walder. And when Lord Wyman Manderley insults House Frey and the dead boy, Hostine Frey kind of loses control and slashes Wyman across the chin. It doesn't kill him, but just creates a little bit of a bloodbath here, as several men from both sides are killed. With tensions running high, the spearwives realize that it's now or never, so they go ahead with their plan and dress Jeyne Poole as one of the spearwives and walk her out of the room unnoticed. However, once they're out from Ramsay's quarters and from the hall, things begin to go awry because they encounter two guards, and the guards engage the Spearwives in battle. And as they do, Theon grabs Jeyne and makes a run for it. They go up to the parapets of Winterfell, and then they realize that, oh shoot, we don't have a rope. The Spearwife that had a rope actually just recently got killed by one of the guards. So with nowhere else to turn, and no rope, Theon grabs Jeyne, and they leap from the battlements of Winterfell into the snow below. Wow. What a fantastic character arc this has been for Theon Greyjoy throughout this entire Dance of Dragons book. Despite the fact that I had reservations about this character back in A Clash of Kings, and I mean, truthfully, that was by design by George R. R. Martin. We weren't supposed to like this character, but the fact that now, by the end of A Dance of Dragons, I sympathize and empathize with this character and really just want the best for Theon Greyjoy and want him to get out of this, I am so elated for him. It is a wonderful character transformation for this character. Theon Greyjoy is honestly the MVP of A Dance of Dragons, and I am so happy for him. So now that he's jumped from Winterfell, he makes a run for it to who knows where. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Planetos, Tyrion, Penny, and Jorah Mormont have officially made it to Meereen. Hooray! Well, kind of hooray. They were on board of a slaver ship. But anyway, as they arrive into Meereen, they're sold into slavery to this man named Yezan Zokagas, and Brown Ben Plum and the Second Sons. They believe they recognize Tyrion Lannister, and Tyrion just kind of tries to stay below grounds, trying to hide within Yezan's camp, making sure that Ben Plum doesn't actually realize who he is, because obviously there's a lot of people who are currently out to kill Tyrion, as Cersei Lannister has placed a bounty over Tyrion Lannister's head. Elsewhere in Meereen, Hizdar Zolorak, Dany's new husband, hosts a grand feast with the Yunkish lords and sellsword captains to celebrate the signing of a peace agreement and the reopening of the fighting pits. However, despite this, Meereen is still under siege, and the bloody flux, which was brought here by a lot of refugees that are currently staying outside the walls of Meereen, is spreading through both Yunkish and Meereenese forces. During the feast, Brown Ben Plum approaches Daenerys and justifies his betrayal to her, and Daenerys just wants nothing to do with this man and tells him to get out of her sight. Seeking to replace the Second Sons, Dany considers other mercenary groups. However, she sets her sights at the Windblown. Daenerys summons Quentyn Martell, much to Barristan Selmy's delight, as Barristan believes that Quentyn is their best chance at getting back to Westeros. However, instead, Dany brings Quentyn to the Dragon Pit and introduces him to two of her caged dragons, Viserion and Rhaegal. Again, Drogon is off flying elsewhere. And she reminds Quentyn that she, Khaleesi, is a dragon too. And she warns Quentyn that he's not safe here in Meereen, as men like Daario and Hizdar may see him as a threat. But our old hero's journey, Quentyn refuses to leave. He's determined to fulfill his mission, and pluckily, he'll bring Daenerys back to Dorne so that he can marry her, darn it. Anyway, that night, Daenerys returns to her chambers, and she dreads the reopening of the fighting pits that is to take place the next day. Because despite all her efforts to end slavery, her peace did not free slaves. So the next morning, Dany and Hizdar make it to Daznak's pit, the pit where there's just all sorts of fighting going on. 20,000 spectators are enjoying jousts, they're enjoying fights, including a entertaining little dwarf joust starring Penny and Tyrion here. However, when Dany realizes that lions will be loosed on them, she refuses to allow it and calls for no lions, which I'm sure Tyrion would be grateful for if he learned that it was Dany who had stopped this lion attack. So some gory fights take place, which of course disgust Dany. However, as she stands up to leave, Strong Belwas, one of her and Barristan's most trusted companions, suddenly falls ill after eating quite a few fried locusts. Dany doesn't know what's going on, and as chaos is erupting in the fighting pits with the fall of this Strong Belwas man, who should happen to reappear but Dany's trusty uncaged dragon, Drogon. Having been drawn to Daznak's pit by the scent of blood and screams, he lands in the pit and begins setting fire to people and animals. The crowd erupts in terror, as many of Hizdar's men are quickly laid waste as they attempt to tame the beast. That is until Dany jumps down into the pit below, runs in front of Drogon, and in one of the book's coolest set pieces, she whips Drogon with her whip until he finally submits to her and allows Dany to mount him. And as she clambers onto Drogon's back, Drogon beats his powerful wings and takes flight away from the city. Dany is finally flying. Wow. Oh my gosh. I'm not gonna lie, guys, if you couldn't tell by my tone of voice, I'm not exactly a big fan of a lot of these SOC storylines. Everything that happens in Meereen, I could not care less about. It's just a barrage of names and people that I don't particularly care about, storylines that are not as immersive. However, wow, did George R. R. Martin build up to quite a fantastic set piece here, because Dany's escape from Daznak's pit is, in my opinion, very well done and one of the key cornerstones of this book. Anyway, elsewhere along the SOCCs, who should we have but the return of another A Feast for Crows character? Oh, dodge the hurricane. Victarion Greyjoy! Woo! Victarion Greyjoy and his Iron Fleet are anchored near the Isle of Cedars up here. Victarion was in A Feast for Crows sent by his brother, supervillain magical final boss Euron Greyjoy, to bring Daenerys back to Euron so that the one-eyed man can marry Dany in some scandalous supervillain magical marriage. However, Victarion, wanting to take a stab at his brother Euron, wants none of that and instead desires to take Dany for himself from under Euron's nose. But anyway, Victarion's sea voyage has not gone smoothly and according to plan, as various hurricanes here have scattered Victarion's fleet, and only half of his original ships he sailed from the Shield Islands have regrouped back with him. And even worse still, Victarion's shield hand is rotting from a wound he suffered while taking the Shield Islands way back in A Feast for Crows. But then fate, oh that rascally devilish fate, conspires with Victarion, because on board one of the ships that regroups with Victarion, who should be on board but a man named Mokorro, who was fished out from the water from one of Victarion's shipmates' ships, display Mokorro to Victarion, and Victarion is like, "Who are you?" And Mokorro was like, "I see it in the flames. You will die unless you let me cure your arm in this magical ritual that I will do on you." And although Victarion's men are suspicious of Mokorro, Victarion trusts Mokorro enough to allow him to heal his arm. And sure enough, after the ritual is done, Victarion's arm is not only healed, but has become blackened, volcano-like, and wreathed in heat and power. Oh, this thing is so cool. Excited by his new arm, and me too, I'd be excited by that new arm too, Victarion immediately has Maester Cerwyn killed for his uselessness and takes on Mokorro as his new companion. With Mokorro by his side, and by extension 2 gods, Victarion is able to capture a number of trading ships and grow his naval prowess even more. He also sacrifices 7 Lyseni bed slaves in a pyre in commemoration of the Lord of Light. And in return, a favorable wind rises for the Iron Fleet. A favorable wind that will take them to Meereen. Satisfied with himself, Victarion goes down into the cabin of his ship and decides to take a dusky woman, another gift from Euron Greyjoy. And as Victarion is taking this woman and telling her all these deep and dark, dirty secrets about how he's going to stab his brother in the back and take Daenerys for himself, and how he's going to have someone else blow this dragon horn that was also gifted to Victarion from Euron, fans have theorized that Euron Greyjoy, who also potentially has the ability to warg into other objects and people and things, is during these taking situations, warging into the Dusky Woman and listening in on all of Victarion's private conversations. Although, let's be real, Victarion is as dumb as a stump, so you don't really need to warg into anybody to really know what this oaf is thinking. But regardless, Victarion tells her everything, and as he does, Victarion, Mokorro, the Dusky Woman, and everyone on board continues their journey off to Meereen. To do what? Guess we'll have to find that out in the Winds of Winter. Oh, George R. R. Martin, you big tease. Closer to Meereen, but still within outside the walls of Meereen, Yezan Zokagas is dying from the bloody flux, and Nurse, Yezan's main slave driver, has already succumbed, poisoned by mushrooms Tyrion collected from Ilior's manse. Ah, those Chekhov's mushrooms. Gotta love them. Seizing the moment, Tyrion, Jorah, and Penny, under the pretext of fetching water, leave Yezan's slave camp. However, they are soon recognized by Brown Ben Plum, the person who earlier in the story wanted to buy Tyrion from the slaver ship that arrived in Meereen. So Brown Ben Plum drags Tyrion into his place of business, and they discuss plans for what happens next. Within Meereen, after Dany took off from Daznak's pit on Drogon's back, we are introduced to a brand new POV perspective, that being that of Barristan Selmy. Barristan within Meereen worries about Daenerys, who has not yet returned from her flight on Drogon's back, and many people within the city of Meereen fear her dead. The Pale Mare is also spreading throughout Meereen and the Yunkish camp, and meanwhile Strong Belwas, who was the one who succumbed to the poison locust during the events at Daznak's pit, remains in critical condition from the poison locusts. Also with Dany gone, Hizdahr Zolorak tightens his grip on power, dismissing Barristan Selmy from his court, and surrounding himself with pit fighters instead of Unsullied. But later that night, Missandei, one of Daenerys' gal pals from way back in A Storm of Swords, reveals to Barristan Selmy that Skahas Mokandak, the Shavepate, has requested a secret meeting with Barristan. So at sunset, Barristan meets the Shavepate in the stables, and Skahas drops a bombshell on him, saying that Hizdahr Zolorak is the perfumed seneschal from Quait's warning. Skahas also reveals that it was the Sons of the Harpy who poisoned the locusts, intending to kill Dany, not Belwas. And if that wasn't enough, Hizdahr is currently at the moment preparing to hand Meereen over to Volantis as well, in order to ensure that Meereen remains open for slavery business for years to come. So later at court, the newly crowned king, Hizdahr Zolorak, is meeting up with a whole host of Yunkish officials as they blah 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 on about everything and nothing at the same time. However, after the processions, Barristan Selmy meets with Quentyn Martell and crew and advises Quentyn, bro, you gotta leave Meereen, you gotta go back to Doran. Hizdahr is eventually gonna take notice of you. I mean, he's already taken notice of you. You're not a friend here at Meereen. Get out of here before it's too late. But the plucky young Quentyn goes on and on about how is its mission to make his father proud, and he's here for that Martell Targaryen alliance, and Doran Martell, his father, will finally get his vengeance against the Lannisters. But Barristan chides him by telling him, bro, get over yourself and your so-called hero's journey. You're taking up some precious page time here. You're not a hero, and Dany will never marry you. With all due respect. Quentyn mulls over Barristan's words for a quick millisecond and considers going home, but he fears more letting his father down and having the Sand Snakes mock him for eternity than he does whatever potential wrath comes his way here in Meereen. Quentyn needs to complete his mission, per Quentyn, so he tells Garrus and Archibald, you guys can leave without me and do what you need to do, but I need to complete my mission. And his loyal companions, Garrus, Drinkwater, and Archibald Euronwood, are like, bro, we're not going to leave you alone. Like, we're your pals. We're your friends. We're in this together. Let's do this. So Quentyn with Garrus and Archibald, having seen the dragons in Dany's underground cage, Quentyn schemes to steal a dragon and bring that dragon back to Doran in order to allow his father Doran Martell to use the dragon for his own purposes. Quentyn reveals that he has some Targaryen blood within him, which he believes should be enough to quell one of the beasts. This in addition to the fact that Dany pretty much blatantly told Quentyn when Quentyn met up with her for the first time that the lack of a Dany-Quentyn marriage need not be the end of his mission, for she knows he's only after fire and blood. And Quentyn thinks on that. In his head, he surmises, that's right, fire and blood. I will make my father proud. But before he can steal a dragon, he does need the help of the Tattered Prince, the prince who he kind of betrayed in order to get closer to Daenerys under the pretext of, actually, no, I'm not working for the Windblown anymore. I'm actually working for you, Daenerys, despite the fact that this was the Tattered Prince's plan all along. So the prince eventually hesitantly agrees to help the Dornishmen, but only on the condition that they pay the prince back with the town of Pentos. A town I didn't know was for sale, but the Tattered Prince seems to think so, so who am I to say? Back in Castle Black, Alice Karstark, the female who came to Castle Black on a dying horse, weds Sigorn, the Magnor of Then, forging an alliance between the Wildlings and House Karstark. Meanwhile, Jon Snow is reading a letter from Cotter Pike, where Cotter Pike details that he has just left Eastwatch en route to Hardhome, when just then, a horn blows twice, the signal for returning Wildlings. Val, the Wildling princess, has succeeded in her mission in retrieving Tormund Giantsbane and his 3,000 to 4,000 Wildlings from the Haunted Forest back to Castle Black. So Jon Snow then officially meets up with Tormund Giantsbane in a wonderful reunion, as these two have not met eye to eye since the events of Jon Snow's betrayal of the Wildlings back in A Storm of Swords. And Jon Snow and Tormund Giantsbane, despite having differences in the past, they get along pretty well in this chapter. They don't see eye to eye completely, but they're good chums. They're like, that betrayal stuff, that's okay. That's water under the bridge or whatever. But anyway, it is here during this meeting with Tormund Giantsbane that Jon Snow agrees to let Tormund and 4,000 wildlings, including mammoths and giants, cross through the wall into Westeros proper. It's a historic moment for the continent, despite Bowen Marsh not being entirely happy about this decision because he had rather die than let wildlings take refuge in several of the empty castles, but you know what? Bowen Marsh can take that toot and shove it straight up his nose for all I care. Afterward, Val accompanies Jon to see Queen Selyse in her quarters, and it is here where he tells the Queen of the successful negotiating tactic between the wildlings and Jon. Selyse is happy, but Jon reminds her that the wildlings will not kneel for anyone, and they are free folk. They are free to do as they please. But it is here in Queen Selyse's quarters where Val finally gets a good first look at Shireen, Princess Shireen, and her half-disfigured kind of gray-scaled face. And once they leave Queen Selyse's quarters and talk in private, Val kind of reprimands Jon and tells him, Jon, that queen and you better get rid of that girl if you know what's good for you. And Jon's like, what the heck are you talking about? Like, that grayscale that's on her face, that's been quelled. Like, it's stopped. It's like, no, she's a monster and she will bring death to everyone here, including me and our free folk friends. But Jon's like, well, what are you talking? You're freaking high. That grayscale's contained. We have nothing to worry about. So Val just cedes and runs off. Oh, Shireen being a monster, eh? Maybe some potential Shireen being burned alive foreshadowing. Anyway, the wildlings pass south through the wall. It's a successful crossing, and then Jon Snow receives another letter from Cotter Pike, this time detailing that he has arrived safely at Hardhome. However, Hardhome is currently a bunch of chaos, as there's a bunch of wildlings that are dying. There's dead things on land, dead things in the water. It's massive chaos. They need more help. And he also tells Jon Snow that there are currently slaver ships here on Hardhome taking a bunch of wildlings back to Essos for the purposes of slavery. Oh man, things are pretty bad here at Hardhome. Off in Griffin's Roost, we meet a familiar face in none other than the character we haven't seen in quite a while, Jon Connington. Jon Connington has finally made his way back with the Golden Company to Westeros, and Jon Connington is making his former home, the former home of the Conningtons and Griffin's Roost, his home for the foreseeable future. Well, temporarily foreseeable future. At the castle here, Jon Connington reminisces about his greatest failure, that being the Battle of the Stony Sept, and we get some pretty interesting flashbacks here as Jon Connington kind of details the events that led to essentially the downfall of Jon Connington as a person of nobility here within Westeros. He refused to burn a town down, that town being Stony Sept, where Robert Baratheon was hiding, and because he refused to burn that town down, Robert Baratheon managed to get away, and the rest is history, what with the death of Rhaegar Targaryen. Although it's not explicitly said, it is heavily implied here that Jon Connington had a romantic interest in Rhaegar Targaryen. I don't believe Rhaegar reciprocated his feelings, but Jon Connington definitely had a deep longing of a crush for Rhaegar Targaryen, and it is Rhaegar's death that has motivated Jon Connington to make it this far to Essos to then meet up with Rhaegar's alleged son, Aegon Targaryen, and try to make Aegon's deceased father proud by raising this young boy up to be the king that Rhaegar was destined to be. So while Jon Connington is reminiscing about this, the Golden Company within the walls of Griffin's Roost is also plotting their next move. Jon also takes the time here to secretly treat his growing grayscale that's kind of crawling up along his fingers and into his hand, the palm of his hand. He really cannot allow anyone else to know about this disease because he fears that if people find out of his grayscale, they will immediately abandon ship and go elsewhere. So 4 days after taking the castle, Jon informs Aegon / young Griff that their next move is they will attack Storm's End and take more lands here within southern Westeros, and therefore they'll really get the attention of the people of King's Landing. They'll have nowhere else to turn but turn south and try to do battle with the Golden Company, which, if I haven't made it clear before, the Golden Company are a bunch of badasses, and you really should not take battling against them lightly. Aegon agrees to this, but on the condition that he be the one to lead the attack at Storm's End. And Jon Connington is kind of taken aback by this and is like, oh, when did the boy get so confident? It's almost as if there was a villainous dwarf who kind of played with his confidence and gave him a little bit of an ego. But anyway, the events of them taking Storm's End and what happens afterward will unfortunately have to wait until the Winds of Winter. Meanwhile, further north at the Crofters' village, Asha Greyjoy remains a prisoner of Stannis Baratheon's camp. Stannis' men have been trapped here within the snowstorms at the Crofters' village for the past 19 days. Food is running out, the lake's fish supply is dwindling, and the men have been eating their dying horses. Stannis, meanwhile, has rarely been seen, as he's kind of isolated himself atop of a watchtower, creating a fire of some kind and looking into it, trying to decipher what's to come. The camp is in dire spirits, and it looks as if Stannis might be on the losing end of this upcoming battle. However, suddenly, riders approach the camp. The newcomers immediately reveal themselves to be Tyker Nestris, the envoy from the Iron Bank of Braavos, and he's accompanied by 7 Iron Men he ransomed, including Christopher Botley. However, there's also 2 other individuals there that grab her attention. Someone who's dressed to look like a northern girl, but right next to her, Asha, in shock, sees a decrepit old man, someone who looks vaguely familiar, and then it dawns on her. This individual arrives in front of Asha, looks up at Asha, and he says, "Theon. My name is Theon. You have to know your name." Boom. Character transformation arc complete. Oh my gosh. Again, as I've said before, Theon truly not only has the best character arc, but the best POV perspective in this book. And now, ladies and gentlemen, for the first time in this book, we return back to the capital of Westeros, King's Landing, where we meet up with our very familiar, very amazingly psychotic, but beautifully hilarious queen, Cersei Lannister. Oh my gosh, it's been a while. Previously in A Feast for Crows, she was arrested by the High Sparrow for just doing some not nice things for the realm, trying to get Marjorie killed, sleeping around the Red Keep. Oh, those crazy, hilariously fun Cersei-like things. But anyway, she is currently arrested and being held prisoner here, and as she is helpless and exhausted and her septigowlers will just not allow her 1 hour of uninterrupted sleep, she realizes that she has nowhere to turn. She's got no friends here. Jaime Lannister, whom she sent a raven to in the previous book, has not called upon that letter and has returned to King's Landing because, unbeknownst to Cersei, Jaime Lannister has burned her letter. So knowing that there's really no way out for her, Cersei Lannister decides that it's time to confess to the High Sparrow. So her septigowlers allow her to see the High Sparrow, and in front of him, she admits to having extramarital affairs, sleeping with her cousin Lancel, gross, and Osney Kettleblack. And the High Sparrow is like, yes, thank you so much for coming to me with all of your confessions, but I mean to try you for even more things, including a whole host of additional crimes, like having the previous High Septon killed. So the High Sparrow gives Cersei 2 options here. She can either pursue a traditional trial by faith, however, given the evidence that is currently piled up against Cersei Lannister, probably will not go her way, or she can put her fate in the gods and do a trial by combat. But before Cersei Lannister is even allowed to make her choice, she is told that if she wants to leave the Great Sept of Baelor on her own 2 feet, she will have to cleanse her sins by participating in a Walk of Atonement. Essentially what that is that she has to walk naked through the streets of King's Landing as a sort of penance for all the sins she has committed throughout her lifespan. So seeing no other way out of the Sept of Baelor, Cersei agrees to this walk, and sure enough, the very next morning, Cersei's Gowlers, they strip Cersei of all her clothes, they shave her head bald, and then escort her, alongside other members of the faith, including a very pious Lancel Lannister, through the dirty streets of King's Landing, as thousands of common folk gather around the marching route where Cersei's supposed to walk, and they mock her. Some of the common folk look at her in disdain, others throw feces at her. Either way, despite Cersei trying her best to kind of keep her composure throughout this naked walk, she pretty quickly loses that composure, and in one of the most human moments for her character, she begins to cry. The once proud queen is a naked, broken, and ashamed mess, as essentially she's pretty much brought down to earth throughout this walk. As she goes on her walk, the septas that are accompanying her are consistently ringing this bell and chanting shame, shame, shame as a means to add additional punishment for her sins. And it's a pretty introspective chapter for Cersei here, as throughout her walk, we get some pretty interesting callbacks to various moments that happened throughout this series. As Cersei scans the crowd, she sees people who she has wronged in the past, including her father Tywin Lannister, who kind of scowls at her in contempt. She sees someone who looks like Melara Heatherspoon looking at her with accusing eyes for pushing her down the well and killing her when they were kids. She sees Ned Stark glowering at her for what her son Joffrey did to him in a Game of Thrones. And next to him, she also sees Sansa's direwolf lady, whose death lay on the footstep of Cersei. And despite Cersei being a pretty maniacal villain throughout this series, you can't help but feel sorry for her. I mean, this is a lot. This is quite a bit of mockery that's kind of coming her way. And as she's got tears running through her eyes, at one point she thinks she sees someone who looks like her long dead son, Joffrey Lannister. So she runs to this random kid before the Septas kind of bring her back in line and force her to continue her walk. And it's pretty sad. It's a very down to earth moment for this once powerful villain. But anyway, as she gets closer to the castle, she kind of reaches her wit's end and just decides to sprint the rest of the way. At one point, she kind of falls, trips on herself, and sprains her knee, but it doesn't matter. She just wants to get to the castle. She just wants to see her son Tommen and just get this thing over with. So teary-eyed and just destroyed and broken down on the inside, she finally makes it to the castle and finally demands to see Tommen, her youngest son, so she can hug him and cry with him. However, Kevan refuses to allow the young boy king to see his naked mother because, per Kevan's words, she has shamed them all. But just as all seems lost for Cersei, she is suddenly comforted by a familiar-looking 8-foot-tall giant of a man, someone mountainous, someone who rides. And this giant tall man effortlessly picks up Cersei, holds her in his arms, and as she is confused as to the identity of this new giant man, Qyburn approaches her and tells her that this is their newest Kingsguard member. His name is Robert Strong, and he has sworn a vow of silence until all of Cersei's enemies have been destroyed. And with this information, for the first time in weeks, Cersei laughs and laughs and laughs. She says to herself, "Oh yes." And me as a reader, it immediately dawns on me, oh boy, George R. R. Martin is not done with Cersei yet. There's more to come from this wicked witch. But as to what she'll be up to, unfortunately, I guess we'll just have to find out until the Winds of Winter. Oh, darn you, George R. R. Martin. Back in Meereen, Tyrion, who is currently meeting up with Brown Ben Plum, has agreed to sign a whole bunch of documents in an effort to join the Second Sons. However, several of these documents essentially detail what Tyrion needs to sign away in order to join the Second Sons, including signing away Casterly Rock, which Tyrion doesn't really own, but he signs this document anyway, and a whole bunch of gold that the Lannisters will have to pay the Second Sons at the completion of this upcoming battle. Brown Ben Plum commands Tyrion, Penny, and Jorah Mormont to put on some armor in order to get themselves ready for this upcoming Battle of Fire, and as Tyrion does, he realizes that, Penny, I think we're on the losing side of this war. Dany's got dragons. Those dragons are eventually going to come back and burn us all. We need to find a way to get the Second Sons to switch sides back to Dany. And Penny and Jorah agree. Meanwhile, within the walls of Meereen, Sir Barristan Selmy meets with the Shave Pate, Skahaz Mokandak, to finalize their plan. They're going to seize Hisdar Zalorak, overthrow his rule, and install a council more to their liking in order to govern Meereen until Daenerys' return. Throughout this chapter, Barristan also has quite a few introspective thoughts as well, including thinking back to how he probably should have stopped Rhaegar Targaryen from naming a certain Stark girl the most beautiful dame in all the land. You know, R+L=J hints. But anyway, at nightfall, Barristan dons his armor and enters Hisdar's chambers in an effort to catch him by surprise. So once he does, he demands to know if Hisdar conspired with the Sons of the Harpy and if they attempted to assassinate Daenerys with the poison locusts that eventually made their way towards Strong Belwas. At the same time, Quentyn, with the help of his windblown companions, decide to go forward with their plan to steal Dany's dragons. So Quentyn and crew make their way to the underground pit where Dany had shown Quentyn where she keeps her dragons, and he sees Rhaegar and Victarion there. However, they seem to have escaped their chains, and Quentyn is scared. He's like, "Oh, the dragons are just flying around here in the pit. They're just going all crazy. We gotta let them out. We gotta find a way to capture them and get them out safely so that they can be on our side." And his companions, Garrus and Archibald, are like, okay, no, this is too much. Like, Quentyn, there's no way we can tame these dragons. And Quentyn is like, no, there is a way. Remember, I've got the blood of a Targaryen. I can tame these dragons. I saw how Dany did it at Daznak's pit. She just threw a whip at Drogon and was able to tame him. I can do that too. And his companions are like, no, Quentyn, don't do it. But poor, brave Quentyn, wanting so desperately to please his father, to please Doran, to fulfill his hero's journey of this story, and his father's desire for revenge against the Lannisters with fire and blood, takes his whip, and just like he saw Daenerys do in Drogon's pit, he tries to submit the dragons. However, despite all the talk of Quentyn's potential Targaryen lineage, and of his desire to make others proud, the dragons do not care for whatever blood that may be going through Quentyn's veins. And rather than listening to his commands, rather than obeying his whips of his whip, they breathe dragon's fire on him and burn Quentyn Martell right then and there, leaving him dying in his companions' distraught arms. Poor Quentyn. Now, I haven't really made my opinions known on what I think of Quentyn Martell. Truthfully, I actually don't mind him as a character as much as other readers do. However, just like several of these SOC chapters where I think George could have condensed those into a more concise narrative, I do think several of these Quentyn chapters, George could have cut them out and essentially just gotten us to this point where Quentyn releases the dragons, as that is pretty much Quentyn's predominant purpose for this story, is releasing Rhaegal and Victarion into the chaotic wild of the Meereen story. But despite that being his singular purpose, it is kind of tragic that his death was brought upon by his father's desire for revenge, thus once again reinforcing George R. R. Martin's mantra, the people who usually wind up dead are those who try to take vengeance in their own hands, or they're related to someone who tries to take vengeance in their own hands. But anyway, back in Hizdar's quarters, Hizdar denies ever plotting against Dany, but Barristan is unconvinced. So Barristan quickly dispatches of Hizdar's pit fighter guard, and just as Barristan and Skahas move in to arrest Hizdar's Olorak for what they believe his role was in trying to assassinate Dany, a cupbearer arrives in panic and informs Barristan and Skahas that Dany's dragons have been loosed on the city. Oh boy, incoming chaotic battle with dragons overhead, coming up. Meanwhile, back at Castle Black, Jon Snow plans to have a bunch of his men try to go to Hardhome in order to rescue the Wildlings and some of the Night's Watchmen that are currently trapped at Hardhome, until he receives a letter. A letter of the pink variety. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. He receives the pink letter. And within this pink letter, an alleged Ramsay Bolton addresses Jon as bastard before going on this long diatribe about how Stannis is dead after a 7-day battle, which is false. Mance Rayder has been captured, which is probably true, and Mance's spearwives have been flayed. Ramsay wants his bride back, he wants Queen Selyse, he wants Shireen, Melisandre, Val's son, a whole host of people. But above all, he wants his reek back. And if Jon does not comply, Ramsay will cut out Jon Snow's heart and eat it. Now, there's lots of theories out there as to who people think actually wrote this letter, which we're not really going to delve into, but I personally believe it's just Ramsay being cranky about Jeyne and Theon being gone. So he's essentially venting his frustrations to Jon in this letter and wants Jon to show up at Winterfell. But Jon, being incensed after reading this letter, decides to change his mind about going to Hardhome and instead makes an impassioned speech to the Wildlings about how they need to retake Winterfell for the good of the realm. We need to show this Ramsay Snow who's boss around here. We need to stand up to him and eat his heart out. And a lot of the Wildlings cheer and they go, aye, aye. However, something strange is happening in this auditorium where the Wildlings are cheering. None of the Night's Watch are cheering in return. No, the Night's Watchmen are walking out of the auditorium. And Jon finds that strange. And then he hears a scream outside. Someone is messing with One, this friendly giant who's been hanging around Castle Black. And as Jon makes his way to this giant in order to see what's going on, he turns around and he gets stabbed by one of the Night's Watchmen. You see, in addition to the Night's Watchmen just being fed up with Jon and how chummy he's been with the Wildlings this entire book, they're also not fans of Jon interfering with the shenanigans that are going on south of the Wall. The Night's Watch is supposed to stay neutral to all these things, but by Jon deciding to go to Winterfell with an army completely goes against the vows of the Night's Watch. So this, in addition to just general racism, several of the Night's Watchmen line up and just take a stab at Jon in the heart, one by one. Jon, being stabbed 4 consecutive times, falls to the ground. He lies splayed out in the snow, and his blood seeps through. However, just before Jon Snow dies, he utters the word, ghost, and then he passes out. Is Jon dead? Did he warg into ghost? I mean, let's be real, he probably warged into ghost and is probably not dead. And I don't just say that because the show essentially spoiled what happens to Jon, but if you reread this book, there's so many clues as to people warging into animals and people warging into other things in order to escape death that essentially foreshadow Jon warging into ghosts just before he dies. However, what Jon Snow gets up to once he's in Ghost and once he inevitably gets resurrected back into his own body and what happens from there is still kind of a mystery, but up to this point, I'm pretty sure that Jon's not dead and he's just sleeping like a baby. But from the A Song of Ice, we return back to the A Song of Fire. Quentyn Martell, who has been lying in Dany's bed, has finally passed away after 3 agonizing days. With an angry Yunkish mob outside the walls of Meereen demanding Hizdahr Zalorak's release and the deaths of Viserion and Rhaegal, Barristan Selmy meets with his war council in order to try to figure out what to do next. They come to the conclusion that Yunkai will never accept terms of peace, and so to that, Barristan responds by saying, fire and blood. After the council meeting, Barristan meets with Garrus Drinkwater and Archibald Weirwood and informs them of Quentyn's death. Garrus blames Daenerys, but Barristan silences him, essentially stating that Quentyn came here on his own for political gain for his father, not love. However, Barristan does offer them a deal. In exchange for freeing them from their prison and getting them on a ship back to Doran with Quentyn's bones, they must return to the Windblown and talk to the Tattered Prince and offer him up Pentos. But only if the Tattered Prince is able to protect and free hostages during the upcoming battle. They agree, and sure enough, it does look like it's about to be a battle of fire, if you will. All this is coming to a head just as the Yunkish forces are now beginning to catapult not just rocks at the walls of Meereen, but dead corpses as well. Corpses of people who have been taken by the pale mare that is spreading through the Meereenese and Yunkish camps. But where the heck has Daenerys been throughout this entire latter part of the story? She sure has been missing for some key events here in Essos. Why, she's been up here, randomly wandering out throughout the Dothraki Sea with her new pal Drogon. Despite Dany's desire to fly back to Meereen, Drogon has been unconvinced to fly back there and has just kind of been lounging around, just kind of feasting on whatever he could find. So as Dany has been wandering through this Dothraki Sea, just miserable, malnourished, and passing whatever little she's able to eat and drink, she begins to have a number of hallucinations, including visions of Quaithe, her deceased brother Viserys, and most pivotally of all, Jorah Mormont, who, like Mufasa and the Lion King, comes to her in a vision to tell her, "Remember who you are, Simba." Daenerys. And Dany, being emboldened by imaginary Jorah's words, she says to herself, "Yes, I am the blood of the dragon. I am the mother of these dragons. My rightful place is in King's Landing, in Westeros. As ruler of Westeros, I am the queen of the Andals. I am the ruler of this world." But before she can convince Drogon to take her back to King's Landing, who should she happen upon? But someone familiar, someone we haven't seen since the Game of Thrones. A Dothraki Khalasar of 50 people find and surround Dany and Drogon. A Khalasar led by none other than Khal Drogo's former Cole, Khal Jaqo. And that, comrades, is how A Dance with Dragons comes to an end. What? Why are you looking at me like that? You're unsatisfied? You thought the ending to that book was pretty anticlimactic? That after all that build-up and all that lore and story, we were actually going to get a proper resolution to A Dance with Dragons where we get not just one, but maybe 2 massive battles to properly finish out this story? Well, that, my friends, is one of the big sticking points about this book. Not only did we only get half of our promised cast of characters for the first 2/3 of this book, but just as the story looks like it's about to hit maximum overdrive with the Battle of Ice between Stannis and the Bolton forces, and the Battle of Fire between Meereen and Yunkai, the book comes to an unexpected and anticlimactic end. Now, George did originally intend to give A Dance with Dragons a proper exclamation point by ending this book on these 2 big battles, But in typical George R.R. Martin fashion, he thought it was best to garden out some of the other aspects about the story. You know, discussions about Essos lore, sellsword companies, the Shrouded Lord, so much so that George R.R. Martin actually ran into the manuscript page limit for Dance with Dragons and had to cut out these two big battles and postpone them until the Winds of Winter. Now, I know we still don't have the Winds of Winter, and maybe never will, so it's probably unfair to call a lot of this content unnecessary, but whoa. Although you probably can't tell based on the whatever this length of this video will wind up being, but I actually skimmed through so much of Jon, Dany, and Tyrion's POV chapters just to give you guys only the most necessary information. And even then, there's a lot here that I think could have been cut out and made room for the battles of ice and fire. But not all is lost, because even though the book proper does have a rather disappointing ending, the epilogue definitely does not. At the very end of this book, as it looks like Kevan Lannister, Randall Tarly, and Mace Tyrell are finally setting the realm aright after Cersei's paranoid Queen Regent ruling, who should return to the story but my man Varys here, the Spider, who we haven't seen since the Storm of Swords. Having already killed Grand Maester Pycelle with a crossbow bolt through the heart, goodbye loser, Varys strikes Kevan Lannister in the chest with a crossbow bolt as well. The eunuch regretfully tells Kevan that he must die, not for who he is, as Varys actually respects Kevan, but because Kevan was succeeding too well in restabilizing the realm for Tommen, and Varys can't have that, because Kevan's death will assure that the kingdom gets thrown back into chaos, breaking the fragile alliances holding King's Landing together just in time for the arrival of Aegon Targaryen VI. Kevan is confused, thinking about how, wait a minute, like Aegon died at Maegor's Holdfast, this makes no sense. But Varys reassures him that no, Aegon is still very much alive, but you, my friend, will not be for very much longer. So once Varys is finished rambling on with this super interesting monologue, he has his little birds finish the job as they stab Kevan to death, so that he doesn't go spilling Varys and Illyrio's secrets to the realm. And that's how A Dance with Dragons really ends. Oh man, whew, I'm exhausted. Again, I don't know how long this video is going to wind up being, but I've got 3 hours and 45 minutes worth of footage that I'm going to have to edit through and condense into a hopefully not too long summary, but we'll see. But until then, thank you so much for being patient with me for this entire wait for this A Dance with Dragons summary video. I really do appreciate all of your guys' support and for watching this video. Seriously, if you made it this far, you are truly the best. Thank you so much. I hope this video lived up to all of your expectations. If you liked it, please consider giving me a like, commenting, subscribing, and potentially also clicking that join button down below if you feel so inclined. Not only are you helping to support me in making these fun but incredibly long videos, but you also get early access to videos, members-only videos, and a whole bunch of perks just for becoming a YouTube channel member. But if that's not for you, then no worries. Thank you regardless for watching this video. I truly do appreciate every single one of you. Stay tuned to my community posts for future videos, but until then, the Advocate, out.